Chapter 286. Suddenly a whistle rang out. From the houses on both sides of the street, a few black-clothed men jumped down and rushed into the middle of the group of noblemen. In a flash they scattered the group. The people of the Chenian unit were, after all, longtime spies, and they acted with propriety. They only called out to the other side's horses, and in a moment, the youths all dismounted. But what surprised Fan Xian and the others was that these youths did not fall to the ground. Instead, they stood awkwardly on the ground. It seemed that the martial education of the next generation, in the Duke's manner, was quite effective. F*CKU. Cut them down. The leading youth was only about 14 years old, but his face was full of fierceness. Seeing that there were suddenly a few more people on the other side, he was not afraid. These youths had run amok in the capital for a long time. When had they ever been afraid of anyone? He held a knife in his hand and slashed at the black-clothed man closest to him. The knife was sinister and ruthless. This subordinate of Fan Xian knew the noble status of these youths. Seeing that the other side's chest was wide open, he did not dare to hand over his knife. The other side was clearly so young. How could they use such a method of mutual destruction? He dodged to the side, but his left shoulder felt cold. He had been cut open. The youth laughed arrogantly. These people know who we are. They won't dare to do anything. Brothers, kill to your heart's content. There were many of these youths. Even an elephant could not withstand the entanglement of ants. Furthermore, the people of the Chenian unit all knew the other side's identity, so it was not convenient for them to deal heavy blows. The youths, on the other hand, were used to running amok on the streets. They knew that the people of the court would not dare to kill them for the sake of their grandfathers. So they used this opportunity to use mutual destruction. Furthermore, they were quite strong. For a moment, the Chenian unit was thrown into confusion. Although some youths were knocked unconscious by the people of the Chenian unit and fell to the ground, the two sides were basically evenly matched. The clanging of knives and swords rang out in the darkness of the long street. The servants holding torches also drew close. There was a little light, and their faces were full of disdain. They were not worried at all. In the carriage, Fan Xian watched this scene, and his expression gradually darkened. He knew that the Chenian unit was his personal bodyguard. Even if they were not as powerful as Gauda's tiger guards, they were more than enough to deal with these young nobles. But these officials of the Overwatch Council had served the court for a long time, and they couldn't do anything to these damned, wandering heroes. Although he knew that his subordinates were afraid of causing trouble for him, and that the Chenian unit would rather risk his life than let these youths lay a finger on him, he was very unhappy to see his trusted subordinates fight so vexedly, and those youths being so arrogant. It was just like how he felt in his previous life, when AC Milan was overturned by Liverpool. Nonsense. Fan Xian walked down from the carriage and cursed angrily. His voice was mixed with his tyrannical zhenqi, and spread throughout the battlefield on the long street. The battle, which had been separated into several areas, was temporarily stopped by this shout. The members of the Chenian unit took advantage of this opportunity to retreat to the side of the carriage. It was only their first encounter, but there were already 2 people injured. Fresh blood flowed from their bodies. For one, the Chenian unit did not dare to be too ruthless. For another, it was because the youths were too ruthless. Each knife was stabbing toward a fatal spot. Fan Xian looked at his subordinates. A helpless expression rose to his face. When we were fighting the Northern Qi people, why didn't I see you all so useless? The subordinates lowered their heads in shame. Their chests rose and fell continuously. They were not satisfied. They thought to themselves, how could these little bastards be a match for me? But, damn, these little bastards were too ruthless. It was impossible for them to personally kill the grandsons of the dukes. If they fought, they would be at a disadvantage. At this time, Deng Ziyu also got down from the carriage. His face was ashen as he watched the youths coming closer and closer. The youths were laughing arrogantly and holding their blood-stained knives. They looked at the people around the carriage like they were chickens waiting to be slaughtered. Sir, their identity is a bit. Don't worry, we will handle it well. Deng Ziyu looked at Fan Xian's increasingly ugly face and explained in a low voice. Fan Xian was so angry that he laughed and said, Identity? I only know that they are a group of thieves who blocked the road and got themselves injured. If this gets out, people will laugh at us to death." "Hey kid, what are you talking about?" The leading noble young man had already approached the carriage on horseback, and the trace of hostility between his eyebrows was even more obvious. "Hand over the girl in your carriage, and let your useless subordinates break one of their own arms, and I'll let you go today." Fan Xian looked at him, and then turned his head. The noble youth darkly said, "You pretty boy, I am talking to you. Hand over the girl. How dare you oppose the Baiwa brothel? How do you want to die? Do you want to try out our newly invented giant stick punishment?" His words were obviously obscene and insulting, and the arrogant youths roared with laughter in unison. Fan Xian did not pay attention to the young man's exclamation. He squinted at his subordinates and continued to say, "As long as it is an enemy, you must be ruthless. It does not matter if it is an enemy outside or an enemy inside. Have you not learned this before? Did you think following me was easy, and so you gave it all back to the old cripple?" Seeing the young man in front of the carriage ignore his question, the noble youth was angry. His anger rose, and he completely forgot what the Baiwa brothel had told him to do. His mouth was full of profanities, and he lashed out with his horsewhip toward Fan Xian's head. The two of them were still some distance apart, and the horsewhip was only a few feet long. It could not reach Fan Xian's head, so it was probably just a threat. Fan Xian's eyes flashed with the shadow of the whip, and with a flash of coldness, he raised his left hand. Ah! A scream pierced the night sky. The noble youth's horsewhip had long since fallen to the ground. He held his wrist and howled in pain. A black crossbow bolt had shot out like a ghost, piercing through his palm. Fresh blood dripped down the youth's palm, and the surrounding youths were all dumbfounded. God! Fan Xian dared to use a crossbow bolt. He dared to use a crossbow bolt to shoot at them. Did he not know who these people were? Although these youths had committed many crimes, and had killed many people before, they lacked respect for life. It could be said that they were cold-blooded by nature, but it was the first time they had encountered someone who dared to use such a deadly weapon to harm them. They could not help but be shocked, and a little angry. At this moment, everyone looked at Fan Xian with a strange expression. It was as if they were looking at a dead man. "Sir." Deng Ziyu was also shocked. He was afraid that the commissioner would be angered and kill all the little bastards present. If such a big thing really did happen, for the sake of the Qing court and the stability of the military, no matter how much the commissioner was favored by the emperor, he would not have a good ending. Fan Xian slowly withdrew his left hand and released his fingers from the spring. He glanced at the youths around him, but did not respond to Deng Ziyu's words. His indifferent gaze swept over the faces of these youths. He found that they were indeed very young. The youngest was only about 10 years old. Their young faces were filled with savagery. Although they were savagery, they were still children. No wonder the people of the Qinian unit had acted so slowly. He took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger in his chest. Narrowing his eyes, he said to the noble youths in front of him, "Those who stand in the way will die. Who else wants to be the little arms of a praying mantis in front of the carriage?" His sinister and terrifying black crossbow bolt only temporarily shocked the minds of these lawless youths. In just a few breaths of time, the fear in the eyes of these youths began to be overshadowed by the audacity and ruthlessness of their eyes. The noble youth who had been shot cried out, "What are you waiting for? Kill them all. Kill them all and drag them to Tsang Mountain to fill in the hole. Have you killed anyone before?" Fan Xian suddenly tilted his head and asked with great interest. The noble youth paused for a moment and then cried out, "Scum like you, I will kill one every day." As the two of them spoke, the youths had already rushed forward, their faces full of excitement and thirst for blood. Fan Xian waved his hand to stop his subordinate from drawing his sword and preparing to kill. Amidst the shouting, Fan Xian stretched out his right hand with incredible speed and grabbed the wrist of the youth who was coming at him. His fingers tightened, and with a crack, the youth's wrist bone was crushed. He howled and clutched his wrist as he fell to the ground. With a sidestep, he retreated into the arms of another youth. His hand cleverly rested on the other's forearm. Using his own shoulder as a fulcrum, he pushed down. With a crisp sound, like a red book dipped in syrup, this delicate little arm broke from the middle. It was a beautiful roundhouse kick, but he had very treacherously lowered his leg by a foot, sweeping it across the waist of a youth who had leapt at him with a sinister expression on his face. The force of this kick was so great that the youth who had been sent flying, blood spurting from his mouth, would probably be bedridden at home for at least a few months. Taking a step forward, Fan Xian raised his left hand and chopped down on the neck of the attacker. That person didn't even have the chance to make a sound before falling straight down. Fan Xian was like a wandering spirit walking among these ruthless youths who were like wolves and tigers. Every now and then, he would strike down one of them. On the long street, only the sound of bones breaking could be heard. Crack, 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 crack. The disdainful and shameless cursing of the youths had already disappeared. An atmosphere of fear, as more and more people fell, gradually spread outwards. A few youths at the outermost edge had already begun to sneak away towards the end of the long street. Crack, 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 crack. It was like the sound of the night watchman. There was no king of hell in this world, but the youths still felt that the sound of bones breaking was like the merciless and cold beating of a drum. Everyone in the Qinian unit, including Deng Ziyu, stared wide-eyed at the scene. Their eyes were full of admiration and respect. Although they could also beat back these youths, they certainly wouldn't be able to do it as cleanly and efficiently as Fan Xian. His strikes were ruthless and accurate, injuring the opponents so they couldn't get up, but not taking their lives. Shi Chanli covered his eyes and shook his head. He couldn't bear to watch this scene. Sang Wen, on the other hand, bit her lower lip. Watching Fan Xian's calm actions, she was very excited. She knew what these youths had done. She knew that these youths had harmed who knew how many people in Jingdo. It seemed like a long time had passed, but in reality, it was only a moment. Other than the youths who had escaped, the rest had their bones broken by Fan Xian's heavy hand. They lay wretchedly on the street. Only now did a series of wretched cries begin to ring out. Fan Xian looked at the bleeding youths by his feet, holding their broken limbs. They could no longer be ruthless. He rubbed his newly loosened wrist with some satisfaction. It seemed that the human body structure he had learned from Sir Fei, when he was young, had not been completely forgotten. Then he told Deng Ziyu very seriously, "In the future, don't let me act in this kind of situation. I really can't afford to lose face." He walked in front of the noble youth, who seemed to be the leader. He smiled warmly and asked, "Which family are you from?" This youth was indeed ruthless. He still had a crossbow in his hand. Looking at Fan Xian's sinister methods, he didn't even blink. Instead, he fiercely said, "If you have the guts, then kill me. Otherwise, just wait for your entire family to be executed." Fan Xian smiled and shook his finger. "First of all, I won't kill you. Second, you can't say things like, your entire family to be executed. Only His Majesty has the right to say such things. If you say such things again, perhaps your entire family will be executed." He had no interest in asking this ruthless and obedient noble youth any more questions. He waved his hand and signaled for the driver to drive the carriage over. At this moment, the servants who were holding torches and cheering for their young masters from afar, acting as numb spectators, walked over shakily. Seeing this scene, these servants didn't dare to do anything to the carriage. They only found their masters among the many injured people. They looked at the slowly moving carriage with the eyes of a big black dog. At this time, Fan Xian and his group had already boarded the carriage. The two injured subordinates, full of shame, disappeared into the night. In the carriage, Fan Xian closed his eyes and rested, as if he hadn't acted earlier. The others in the carriage saw that he was silent and naturally didn't dare to speak. Suddenly, Fan Xian opened his eyes and quietly said, "This is strange. For the sake of a brothel, how could they order around these bloodthirsty bastards?" Deng Ziyu asked, "After injuring so many young nobles, do you want to make some preparations? After all, the identity of a master cannot be hidden from many people." Fan Xian looked at him and said, "They are just a group of nobles. There is no need to pay attention to them. The key is the person behind them." Deng Ziyu lowered his voice and asked, "What should we do next?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "Tomorrow, you go to the Baiwa brothel and take back the 10,000 liang of silver." Chapter 287. The carriage followed the quiet streets of the capital and made a few turns. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise coming from a house on the side of the street, but it was not very loud. Deng Ziyu turned his head and reported, "The servants that were following us have been knocked unconscious. The road is clear." Fan Xian smiled wryly and nodded. He said, "Speaking of which, it is strange. Although you were personally chosen by Wang Qinian, I have looked over your records. You are good at following and hiding. How could you have made a move? How come you did not have the authority and prestige of the Overwatch Council?" Deng Ziyu felt ashamed and explained, "Sir, the members of our team are mostly old men from the first and second bureau. Sir Wang is best at following people, so he chose us because we are good at this." He thought for a moment and then said, "Sir, I cannot believe that you have to personally deal with this matter today. It is a dereliction of duty on our part. But could you please transfer some people from the 6th Bureau? They are the true assassins of the Overwatch Council. On the road north, you have seen their abilities. In terms of fighting, they are much stronger than we are." Fan Xian shook his head and did not say anything. He was a little afraid of dealing with the shadow. Occasionally, when he went to visit Chun Pingping, he had seen the assassin appear. Although he was silent, it was clear that the leader of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council was very interested in Fan Xian, who had once studied under Wu Zhu. This interest was not due to the fact that he was gay. It was due to the fact that he wanted to fight Fan Xian. Therefore, he was a little afraid of dealing with the 6th Bureau. In terms of fighting ability, the tiger guards that his father had secretly trained seemed to be stronger than the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. According to Yan Bingyun's calculations, Fan Xian should be able to get his hands on these tiger guards in a few days, so he was not in a hurry. Investigate all the illegal activities of the Baoyu brothel. He quietly gave the order. Deng Ziyu was shocked and asked, "What about the owner of the brothel?" Fan Xian thought for a while and shook his head, saying, "Since the yard is covering for him, we should first attack the outside. First, we will seal off the Baoyu brothel. That will make the man anxious." In fact, he had a feeling that this brothel, which was raking in money every day, had something to do with Li Hongcheng. First of all, Sangwen had said that the mistress of the Baoyu brothel had the surname of Yuan. Secondly, he was able to make use of the brats of the public houses. Furthermore, the marriage between Roro and Crown Prince Jing had long been made known throughout the land. If the second prince was using this as a pretext to suppress the Overwatch Council, then that was a possibility. Thinking that the other party might be using this matter, Fan Xian's anger gradually grew. Although he was working to destroy this marriage, he still would not allow anyone to use his and his sister's name. Fan Xian could not help but feel angry. He looked at Sangwon, who was quietly sitting next to him, and said, "I will have someone escort you out of the city. Once this case is over, you can come back. But first you will have to write a report. Tell me everything you know." Through his conversation with Sangwon, he knew that this girl was very thoughtful and well-organized. She would be of great help to the Baoyu brothel. Deng Ziyu did not understand Fan Xian's intentions in dealing with the Baoyu brothel. He thought that Fan Xian only wanted to vent his anger and find out who within the Overwatch Council was covering for them. Sir Chanli thought a little more, and he looked at his teacher. After receiving a nod, he spoke to Sangwon. "Sir, why don't you ask Mutai? After all, he is the head of the 1st Bureau. When you were not in the capital, Baoyu brothel was on the rise. If he reminded you, then he must know something." Fan Xian closed his eyes and shook his head. If Mutai only reminded me and did not explain everything, then this matter must have something to do with me or my family. If he was able to speak up, that would be enough. There is no need for me to drag him into this. Besides, this is such a small matter. If I cannot handle it myself, how am I going to make a name for myself in politics? The carriage fell silent, and the atmosphere was a little strange. After all, everyone had just witnessed Fan Xian strike like a ghost. Now they looked at this man with a gentle smile on his face, and it felt strange. Fan Xian's martial arts skills, ever since the Nyolan Mountain incident last year, had been known to the world. But the people who had actually seen him fight were few and far between. That was because those people were all dead. So a scene like this one was very rare. Although Fan Xian had warned Mu Tai not to imitate Wang Qinyan's style of flattery, and Deng Ziyu had been listening to him, he could not help but imitate his predecessor's style of doing things. He carefully asked, "Sir, earlier in the Baoyue brothel, why were you so certain that I had so many banknotes on me?" Fan Xian lazily opened his eyes and smiled at him. He said, "Last time, the Cui family gave you 20,000 taels of silver. You said you were worried about your subordinates spending money, so you only gave each of them 100 taels of silver. Here is 3,200 taels of silver. Then, you gave 5,000 taels of silver to Wang Qinyan's family. That leaves you with 11,800 taels of silver." He closed his eyes and said, "You are a thrifty person. Food and clothing are all paid for by the public purse. You even gave Mr. Peng's son's wedding a red packet of 5 taels of silver. After the wedding, you complained to me a few times, saying you wanted to put a stop to this unhealthy practice. It looks like at the very most, you can only earn 2 taels of silver a month. You and Wang Qinian are not the same. You have never married, and you are a single man. Where would you put the remaining 10,000 taels of silver? You are such a cautious person. Of course you would not leave it at home. Of course you would carry it with you." Fan Xian laughed and patted Deng Ziyu on the shoulder. "But being thrifty is one thing. The widow next to you is not willing to take her in. Then, you should make a few pieces of jewelry. Don't let a woman think you are stingy and stingy. The Overwatch Council cannot afford to lose face like that." The people in the carriage all laughed. Deng Ziyu looked embarrassed and explained, "Sir, about this silver. I reported it to you before I distributed it. 100 taels of silver is not a small amount." Fan Xian laughed and said, "If you are so stingy, how can you be so generous to the Wang family? He is not your superior right now." Deng Ziyu was silent for a moment, then said, "Sir Wang. He is in northern Qi. I always think that if there is a problem, his family will need the silver." Fan Xian did not expect him to say something like this. He sighed and felt a little touched. If it were an ordinary envoy or student of the Qin kingdom, staying in northern Qi would be very safe. In the words of another world, they would be able to enjoy national treatment. But for a spy like Wang Qinian, who knew what would happen to him in the future, Shi Chanli asked, "Are we really going to the Baoyu brothel tomorrow to ask for the silver?" Fan Xian was thinking about Wang Qinian, who was far away in a foreign land. He thought about the recent news that Sea Lily had entered the palace, and his feelings were complicated. Hearing this, he became angry. The Overwatch Council worked hard for the court, but the princes and nobles in the court were fighting each other fiercely. They even wanted to drag the council into these muddy waters. It was truly a bit hateful. "Of course I am going." He looked at Deng Ziyu and coldly said, "Reveal your identity. Earlier, when I was talking to that woman, she said that I had ransomed Sang-Wen from the Baoyu brothel, and that I would return her the next day. But then they came to take her. For an enemy to do what he said, we have to be respectful and courteous. Since we said we would get the 10,000 taels of silver tomorrow, then we must get it back," he said without any hesitation. Tung Zijing received the order and prepared to send Sang-Wen to the estate outside the city the next day, when the city gates opened. After taking care of these matters, Fan Xian returned to his room. Inside the quilt, Wanner saw the worry on his face. She felt sorry for him and asked him what happened. Fan Xian did not hide it from her, and he told her what had happened. Of course, using public funds to buy a prostitute was an opportunity to investigate the case, and it was very open and aboveboard. Wanner looked thoughtful and said, "There is something strange about this." Fan Xian nodded and said, "I think so too." Wano had lived in the palace for a long time, and she did not know much about the public houses in Shangshu Alley. After all, their status was different, so she said, "Tomorrow find a chance to ask Xija's mother. Lu Shi grew up in Shangshu Alley, and her family is a public house. She should be able to get some information." Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat, but he immediately denied his own suspicions. Lu Shi was a shrewd and ruthless person, and she would not drag him down while he was still popular. He now had a better understanding of Lu Shi. This woman had always put the interests of Fan Manor and his father first. Are you going to the Baoyu brothel tomorrow? Warner frowned and said, those children are notorious in the capital. Although you are not afraid of them, you still have to be careful. Fan Xian shook his head and said, do not worry about me. I have always been wary of such things. He smiled warmly and said, when I was a child in Danzhou, what I wanted to do the most was to beat up the hedonistic young masters on the street. But I never got to do that. I never thought I would be able to satisfy my childhood fantasies tonight. Warner gently touched his chest and said, Danzhou? You must be the biggest hedonist there is. Fan Xian did not respond. He said, the scariest thing in the world is not a cold-blooded killer. It is those rich and powerful young men who love to kill without asking for a reason. Because a killer must have a reason to kill. And these rich and powerful young men are just reveling in the excitement. If babies could kill, then they would do it for a drop of milk, because babies are at their most instinctive stage. They do not feel guilty, because they do not understand anything. Therefore, the younger the young nobles in the capital, the less reverence they have for the court and the world. The more ruthless they are, the more daring they are. Once this opening is loosened, it will be like the dam in Jiangnan this year, unable to be blocked again. He shook his head and thought of the ruthless young men who fell at his hands. The deepest worry in his heart floated to the surface in his clear eyes. That night, the fight on the street immediately startled many people. The capital government, which was responsible for the security of the capital, bore the most pressure. The young bullies who ran amok on the street, relying on their family background and the generous treatment of the government, had always been ruthless and lawless. This time, they had stopped the street for a fight and ended up in such a wretched state. It was very surprising. The official in charge of investigating the case, after seeing the injuries of the youths with broken bones and tendons, was shocked. He felt a trace of fear and suspicion towards the culprit, Mr. Chen. It was obvious that the culprit did not care about the power of the dukes. Where did this ruthless person come from? Just as Deng Ziyu said, Fan Xian's identity could not be hidden from everyone in the capital. After the details of that night's events were spread out, although the capital government had not yet found out who this Mr. Chen was, the smart ones were able to smell a familiar scent from the men in black, who jumped out of the houses on the street. Everyone knew that the young commissioner of the Overwatch Council had a group of people called the Qinian Unit. Let Yuan Meng come back. The second prince of the Qin kingdom had a gentle expression on his face. He said, if you offend Fan Xian, you will not have a good life. The crown prince Li Hongqing slowly walked to the window. He felt a chill in his heart. He knew that his cousin was a very meticulous person. He quietly said, no one would have guessed that Fan Xian would go to a brothel. Knowing his stubborn personality, there is no way he would let this go. The second prince smiled and grabbed a dried fruit from the small plate next to him. He peeled off the skin and placed it in his mouth. He slowly chewed and said, the more Fan Xian investigates, the more solid the evidence of the Baoyu brothel is. This will only get more and more interesting. Li Hongqing turned to look at him and coldly said, from the beginning, this was your plan. But why did you give Fan Xian the opportunity to make a move? The second prince seemed to be lost in thought. After a while he said, because I am still looking for a way to reconcile with Fan Xian. The Baoyu brothel is the last chance. If Fan Xian is willing to extend his hand, I will sincerely shake it. I want to give him the opportunity to shake my hand. Chapter 288. The capital government was restricted by the second prince's warning, and they knew that the owner of the Baoyu house had a close relationship with the notorious young thugs of the capital. So, they turned a blind eye to the Baoyu house. The Overwatch Council, however, did not have such concerns. Although they did not have the power to investigate the civil affairs of the capital, they used the excuse of investigating the capital government's malfeasance to find a lot of relevant information. Fan Xian sat in his study and looked at the case in front of him. He could not help but frown deeply. There were two owners of the Baoyu house, and they were very mysterious. Not many people had seen them before. As for the way the Baoyu brothel did things, they were indeed extremely daring. They did things ruthlessly and ruthlessly. They had only opened this spring, and it had only taken a few months for them to use both force and money to shut down the businesses of the other brothels. They had forcefully taken many famous prostitutes into the brothel, and their reputation had suddenly increased. In his trip to the Baoyu house, Fan Xian could tell from the details that the owner of the brothel was a master of business. But under the methods of a normal merchant, there was a dark side to this business. Mutai was right. In just 1 month, 4 disobedient prostitutes had disappeared. They must have died a long time ago. The Baoyu house did even more dirty things in the dark. They accepted young prostitutes and perverted businesses. Fan Xian's frown deepened, and his heart grew colder and colder. Regardless of whether it was his previous life or this one, the world was always dirty. It was just that the sky above Jingdo in the kingdom of Qing was easier to bring to the surface. The nobles relied on the power and position in their hands to endlessly exploit and oppress the common people. Just like what happened with Baoyu brothel, in the officialdom of Jingdo, it was not an exception, nor was it the first. It was a method that all the nobles were used to accumulating wealth. In regards to the poor, the lowly, and the unjust, in the past, Fan Xian was more of a bystander. He coldly watched the ugly things that happened in the world, and he subconsciously did not think about the unfairness and darkness. He was not the Bodhisattva of Guanyin, who saved people from suffering. He had received enough benefits and enjoyment from his position. As someone who had benefited from this, and as a member of the nobles, he naturally chose to be silent and accept it. Silence and acceptance did not mean that he could get used to it. Even though he had been in this jar filled with dirty water for a long time, he still could not get used to it. A mere Baoyu house was not enough to make him change his mind. He might have done something good within his power, such as ransoming Sang One and suppressing the Baoyu house. He wanted the nobles to be gentler when they did things, and he wanted to reconcile the conflicts between the different classes. But he would not try to react like a thunderbolt, because a thunderous reaction meant denying everything that the Baoyu house represented. It meant challenging the entire world. Such a heaven-defying thing. Only Yi Qingmei seemed to have attempted it before. His mother seemed to have failed in the end, but the Baoyu brothel did not seem to be as simple as a brothel. Fan Xian could already smell the uneasiness hidden within. Deep in his heart, an ominous feeling welled up, and an evil fire was born out of nowhere. So, he wanted to personally go to the Baoyu house to confirm whether or not his judgment was correct. It was a sunny autumn afternoon. As the leader of the Qinian unit, Deng Ziyu once again came to the Baoyu house. Seeing his lifeless face, the hired thugs of the Baoyu house rushed forward, ready to beat him to a pulp. But when they saw his lifeless clothes, all the thugs took half a step back. It was as if they were afraid of the coldness that seeped out of his clothes. Deng Ziyu was wearing the uniform of the Overwatch Council, so his identity was different. The Baoyu brothel believed that they had the backing of the Overwatch Council, so they would not do anything to offend the Dragon King. They immediately sent out a person of status to respectfully welcome Fan Xian into a quiet room on the 3rd floor. There was a curtain in the room, so it was impossible to see what was behind it. Beyond the curtain was a round table made of Qingzhou stone. It looked very noble. Si Qinger was full of smiles as she welcomed Deng Ziyu to the table and sat down. She said, "Sir, you are from the Overwatch Council. Last night was very rude. If I had known you were from the Overwatch Council, I would have given Sangwon to you. I would not have dared to accept your banknotes." As she spoke, her eyes looked into the curtain, but she made no move to take out the banknotes. Deng Ziyu knew that there was someone behind the curtain. Perhaps it was the mysterious owner of the Baoyu house. He had been in the Overwatch Council for 8 years, and he had never done business that involved taking advantage of his authority. But Fan Xian had forced him to take back the 10,000 tael banknotes, so he had no choice but to make another trip. After a moment of consideration, he coldly laughed and said, "Lady Si Qinger is very polite. It is just that last night when I left the house, I bumped into a few dogs. Today, I am here to ask if these dogs belong to the house." Si Qinger's face did not change, but she was a little worried. Last night, she thought they were from the 13th Yamen. She did not expect them to be connected to the Overwatch Council. the brothers of the second owner used to run amok in the capital, but last night, they were beaten to a pulp by this man. Today, the man had come to her door again, and his words were sharp and unkind. It seemed that it would be difficult to resolve this peacefully. It was a shame that time had been tight, and she had not been able to find out the man's bottom line. Because of some reason, the Baoyu house did not expect Mr. Chen to be Commissioner Fan. But she still did not think much of the mysterious Mr. Chen, and she would not spit out the 10,000 tael banknotes. This was because the person behind the curtain had given her enough confidence. Si Qinger's face turned cold, and she coldly laughed and said, "Sir, you are very funny. Since when did the Overwatch Council become involved in the business of a brothel? Shouldn't this be the business of the capital government? If you were bitten by a dog, you should be careful not to get sick. You should go home and rest. Why are you here to take care of our business?" She smiled and said, "Sir, you are very fierce." Deng Ziyu's face was stern, and he said, "Stop talking nonsense. If you do not give me an explanation for what happened yesterday, I will tear down this broken brothel of yours." He had been ordered to come here, and he felt very uncomfortable. But his long years of working in the Overwatch Council made his words sound cold and oppressive. Behind the curtain, someone coughed. Si Qinger's face darkened, and she slapped the Qingzhou stone table. She angrily shouted, "I don't know where this bastard came from. How dare he come to the Baoyu house and extort money from us? The contract was written clearly. You have forcefully bought Sangwon, and yet you are not satisfied? If you do not leave, I will strip you of all your clothes and throw you out the door. I will let everyone in the capital see how ugly you are." Deng Ziyu stared into her eyes, and his ears listened to what was happening behind the curtain. He coldly said, "It looks like your brothel is ready to make an enemy of the Overwatch Council." It was just a brothel, and it did not have the right to make an enemy of the terrifying Overwatch Council. But Si Qinger did not panic. She coldly laughed and said, "Do not use the Overwatch Council to scare me. The 6 departments and 3 departments may fall for it, but the Baoyu house will not." Deng Ziyu laughed and said, "You have guts." He stood up, looked coldly behind the curtain, and waved his sleeves, ready to leave. "Stop right there." It had been quiet, and only 2 coughs could be heard from behind the curtain. Finally someone spoke. The voice was young, but it carried with it a sense of disdain and power. The green curtain slowly opened, and the owner of the Baoyu house, who had never seen an outsider before, finally appeared in front of the world. Deng Ziyu turned his head, and his eyes narrowed. He did not know who this person was. He did not expect that he would meet with him. He looked at the young man behind the curtain, who was wearing light yellow clothing. Deep in his heart, he felt it was ridiculous. The Baoyu house was the largest brothel in the capital. It was a brothel that opened its doors every day to welcome customers. It was a brothel that was open every night, and its owner was a boy who was not even 10 years old. Deng Ziyu stared at the yellow-robed little boy with his mouth agape. He suddenly furrowed his brows. Although the little boy's identity was not ordinary, he had suddenly become the owner of the Baoyu brothel. It was truly shocking. After a moment of silence, he finally bent his knees and said, "Deng Ziyu of the Overwatch Council greets the third prince." The third prince, the youngest son of the emperor, was the owner of the Baoyu house. Seeing the Overwatch Council official, who had always had a cruel expression on his face, admit defeat and kneel in front of the second owner, Si Qinger's lips curled up, and she let out a cold laugh. So what if the Overwatch Council was powerful? They were just a dog of the emperor. Her brothel looked ordinary, but behind it was the youngest son of the emperor. "Mr. Deng, is there anything else you would like to say?" Si Qinger's face was full of disdain. Unexpectedly, after Deng Ziyu knelt, he did not wait for the young man to speak. He stood up and spoke with a serious face. "I have come under the orders of the emperor to ask questions. The girl has yet to answer. When I return, I will report back to the emperor. As for what happens in the future, the Overwatch Council will be in charge." The third prince was the youngest son of the emperor of the Qing kingdom. His mother was Yi Guipin, who was very favored in the palace. How could a child like him open a brothel? Although this reality was absurd, it was right in front of his eyes. Deng Ziyu's temples jumped, and he suppressed the emotions in his heart. He bowed and said, "I will take my leave." The third prince's face was still childish. Seeing that this little official wanted to leave just like this, a wave of anger rushed into his brain. He threw a teacup at him. Although Fan Xian had seen at the city gate that the third prince was young and had a lot of calculations in his mind, he was, after all, still a child. He did not receive the respect he wanted, so he flew into a rage. The third prince walked forward, pointed at Deng Ziyu's nose and yelled, "You want to leave? Why did you stop investigating? Didn't you want me to pay you back 10,000 liang of silver?" Deng Ziyu had a wry smile on his face. No matter how powerful the Overwatch Council was, they could not compete with the prince for money. But according to the emperor's way of doing things, the Overwatch Council did not give the prince any face. Fan Xian had warned him again and again last night. Deng Ziyu was the commissioner's trusted aide, and so he did not dare lose face in front of the prince. So he maintained a polite expression and said, "The matter of the money will be discussed by the emperor. But the third prince, it is best that you do not get involved in such places." Si Qinger, who was standing to the side, was shocked. She thought to herself that the Overwatch Council was as arrogant as the rumors said. They did not even give face to a prince. The third prince was only 8 or 9 years old, but he was born into a royal family. The little boy was born with power, and his mind was not simple. He laughed coldly and said, "When did the Overwatch Council become beggars? Asking for money everywhere? How dare you not give me face? Cousin, do you know who this person is?" As he spoke, the half-drawn curtains were pulled back to reveal a group of thugs lying in ambush. Looking at the faces of these thugs, Deng Ziyu's expression froze. He felt that the strength of these thugs was far greater than that of the average thug. And in front of these thugs stood 2 young men. One of them had a ferocious look on his face, and his right hand was bandaged. There was blood seeping from it. It was the man who had his hand pierced by Fan Xian's crossbow the night before. Deng Ziyu's eyelid twitched. He knew that today would not be a good day. But he looked at the person next to the young man who had his hand pierced. His face looked even worse. He was even more shocked than when he found out that the owner of the Baoyu house was the young third prince. He frowned and looked at the chubby young man's left cheek. After a moment of silence, he asked, "Young master, are you also the owner of the Baoyu house?" This chubby young man was none other than Fan Xian's little brother, Fan Xizha. Deng Ziyu did not expect that the Baoyu house that the commissioner wanted to investigate was owned by his own little brother. Compared to the arrogant third prince, and compared to the thugs in the room, who wanted to teach Deng Ziyu a lesson, Fan Xizha's face looked particularly ugly. His face was pale, and aside from the occasional glint in his eyes, there was a fear that came from the depths of his heart. He angrily looked at the third prince and said, "You idiot! Do you know who he is?" The third prince was shocked. He thought to himself, "Even if you are my cousin, why are you insulting me?" He angrily retorted, "How dare you insult me?" Fan Xizha gritted his teeth and took a deep breath. He knew what had happened the night before, and so today, he had brought people to take a look. These people who dared to cut off his path to riches were small characters from the 13 yamens. He did not expect them to be people from the Overwatch Council. He closed his eyes and took 2 deep breaths. Looking at the third prince, he shook his head and said, "Look at what you have done." His heart jumped, and he knew that someone was hiding something from him. The third prince and Fan Xizha were cousins. At the beginning of the year, they had been persuaded to open the Baoyu house together. Everything had been smooth sailing, and he knew that his cousin was a genius in business. But he did not understand why he was acting so strangely today. Even if they were people from the Overwatch Council, what was there to be afraid of? He was a prince, and his brother was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. His young face was full of confusion. Fan Xizha sighed in his heart, and then he looked at Deng Ziyu with hope. He asked, "Mr. Chen from last night, was he?" Deng Ziyu calmly looked at the young man. He did not know why, but he felt a little sad for Fan Xizha, and so he nodded. Fan Xizha's face was wooden. He seemed to be stunned, but his heart was quickly calculating whether or not he should kill Deng Ziyu in front of him, and then quickly escape from the Baoyu brothel. If his brother found out, what would happen to him? Chapter 289. What kind of person was Fan Xizha? In reality, he was just a common youth in the capital, with an excellent family background. That was why he was a famous tyrant in the capital. He was the 12-year-old who had stared at Fan Xian when he first entered the capital, his face full of disgust. Of course, he also had some brains, and knew how to restrain his heir to the title of count. At the same time, he was also a young boy who often revealed his naivety and competitiveness at the mahjong table. He was also a genius who often flipped through account books and developed a fanatical interest that even he himself could not imagine. There were many sides to a person, and Fan Xizha was no exception. He was naive, fanatical, arrogant, and ruthless. If you looked at him from any of these sides, you would be biased. His father was a popular figure in the court, the Minister of Revenue, Count Sinan. His grandmother was the emperor's wet nurse. His biological mother was the sister of Yi Guipin, and his sister Fan Ruoro was the most famous and talented woman in the capital. She was about to marry Crown Prince Jing Li Hongcheng. As for his brother, the one who had vaguely been an enemy, but had actually gotten along well with him, he was the immortal poet of a generation, the most favored young official of the emperor, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and the idol of all scholars. The one who had married a princess, was about to take over the palace treasury, had a seat in the royal study, and was visited by geniuses. He was so red that it was almost purple, and his name seemed to have been framed in gold that no one dared to look directly at. Yes, his good older brother was Fan Xian Sir Fan Jr. Since the founding of the Kingdom of Qing, such a family background had never appeared. What kind of youth would be born into such a hot environment? Before Fan Xian came to the capital, Fan Xizha was already a famous thug in the capital. But at the time, he was still young, and had not yet found his own direction in life. So all he did was eat for free, steal things, ride a horse through the streets, and act like a little tyrant. After all, Ruoro was there to enforce the family rules, so he did not cause any big trouble. But this kind of life had long been planted in his bones, and the seeds of daring had long since been planted in his bones. After Fan Xian entered the capital, his powerful older brother and sister joined forces to make Fan Xizha obedient. On the other hand, Fan Xian, who had always been pressured by his parents to study and become an official, had been weakened by Fan Xian's arrival. Fan Xian seemed to have opened a window for his younger brother that was completely different from that of other nobles. Fan Xizha finally understood what he liked to do, and what he should do in the future. His future was to become the mistress of the Yi family, the kind of wealthy merchant who could rival a nation. He would be able to fully utilize his talent in business and accounting books. As he gradually grew older, his firm goals in life, his genius calculating mind, and the tyrannical aura he had always possessed combined to form the bold and reckless Fan Xizha of today. If he wanted to do business, then what would make him the most money? Of course it was food, drink, and men. Although the Donbo bookstore, under the management of the young man and the seventh shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, was gradually expanding to the whole world, the profits from selling books were not large. Secondly, the bookstore was more or less marked by Fan Xian. Although Fan Xizha did not care about this, he was more concerned about what he could do. At the same time, the third prince in the palace, his cousin, was not satisfied with listening to the Grand Tutor's lectures every day. Using a brain that was far more mature than his peers, he began to discuss with Fan Xizha how to stir up some activity in the capital. One was 14 years old, and the other was only 8. This strange combination created the popular Baiwa brothel in the capital. Because the background of these two boys was too special, this seemingly childish combination brought about unexpected results. The resistance of the government naturally became a help. And when Fan Xizha was pleasantly surprised to discover that Crown Prince Li Hongcheng had a close relationship with the brothel business on the other side of Lujing River, he unceremoniously borrowed the popular maid, Yuan Meng, from Li Hongcheng. With Fan Xizha's business vision, with Yuan Meng's understanding of the business, with the power of the third prince, and with these two boys, who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth, in less than 2 or 3 months, the Baiwa brothel swept through the entire business in the capital. As for how many people died in the process, and how many innocent girls were ruined, it was not within the scope of his consideration. His name was Fantasia. Although he was young, he was still a nobleman. As a nobleman, who cared about the life and death of flesh and blood on the cutting board. Furthermore, as a young man, he did things without fear. This was what Fantasia was most worried about when he spoke with Warner that night. But Fantasia was still afraid. So the Bayou brothel truly began to flourish a month after Fantasia was sent to Northern Qi Kingdom. A few months had passed, and the Bayou brothel had firmly established itself in the capital. Fantasia's worry had lessened, and he thought that even if his brother found out he was running a brothel business, what was done could not be undone. But what he did not expect was that in the half a year since his brother had left for Northern Qi, the situation in the court had changed so much. In the spring, the Fan family had a close relationship with King Jing's family. In the eyes of the court officials, they were on the second prince's side. So Fantasia did not think there was anything wrong with him associating with Li Hongcheng, his future brother-in-law. He did not think there was anything wrong with him associating with the third prince, who had been raised by the second prince. But after Fantasia returned to the capital, Fantasia was shocked to learn that his brother seemed to be in conflict with the second prince. As the son of an official, Fantasia didn't think that his evil deeds in the capital would make his elder brother angry. But his political acumen told him that if his elder brother found out that he was too close to the other side, there would certainly be problems. So in September, he began to tell the people working in the Bayou brothel to keep a low profile. He was anxious to get out of this business, and so he had been very busy. But he did not know who had told the third prince to hide in the palace, and he had dragged things out until today. Fantasia looked at Deng Ziyu, who was standing in front of him. He had seen this Overwatch Council official in the manor, and he knew that he was the leader of Fantasia's entourage. But in the blink of an eye, he gave up on the idea of killing Deng Ziyu. He knew that he was the owner of the Bayou brothel, and his brother would one day find out that he was the owner of the Bayou brothel. You should go back. I will explain this to him myself. Fantasia's chubby cheeks trembled. He must still be afraid. He waved his hand to stop the thugs behind him from rushing into the arena. Now that things had come to a head, the respect they had for their elder brother still prevailed in the end. Deng Ziyu looked at him, bowed deeply, and then left the room. The third prince with a childish voice cursed. You let him go just like that? How am I supposed to walk around the capital? How dare a mere official try to bully me? Fantasia sighed in his heart. He sat down absent-mindedly, and his hands unconsciously stroked the smooth surface of the Qingzhou stone table. He squinted at the girl named Si Qinger, and suddenly asked, Where is Yenner? Si Qinger was confused by the scene in front of her, and she wondered why the owner would be afraid of an official from the Overwatch Council. She was not high enough, and she did not understand the complicated background of this matter. She forced a smile and said, Yenner should be resting in the back of the pavilion. You want to see her now? The 14-year-old Fantasia's eyes were filled with a ruthlessness that only an adult should have. After a while, he made a decision and said, Don't worry. Everything will be the same as before. In his heart, he quickly calculated how he should deal with this mess. If his father knew about this, he would beat him to death. Of course, his mother loved him, and she could even persuade Igui Pin, who was in the palace, to speak to his brother. But his brother, alas, did not even give face to the eldest princess. How could he be persuaded by Igui Pin? Suddenly his heart jumped, and his face lit up with joy. It looked like he would have to beg his sister and sister-in-law. If they spoke, his brother would not punish him too harshly. I have business to attend to, so I will leave now. Fantasia coldly stared at the third prince. He knew that there was something strange going on. Although he was young, he was a strong man who was willing to cut his own wrists. He coldly said, I will not come to this place in the future, and I do not care about the profits. But I want you to calculate my share in 3 months. The third prince scratched his head and laughed. You have second brother and your future brother-in-law to support you? What are you afraid of? Fantasia ignored him, and his eyes were filled with hatred. He told Si Qinger, Send the 10,000 taels of silver to the other party immediately. Who knows, it might even save your life. Si Qinger nodded in agreement. She finally understood that she had offended someone she should not have. In the private room on the third floor of Baiyue brothel that was next to the lake, Fan Xian's eyes were still looking at the boats, birds, and people on the lake. His fingers gently tapped on the table. His face was calm as he calculated this matter. Without spending much energy, he had already sorted out all the clues. Since the owners of this brothel were Fan Xizha and the third prince, the capital government would not investigate it. The Overwatch Council, for Fan Xian's sake, would not make things difficult for them. Perhaps the people in the first bureau still suspected that the owner of this brothel was Fan Xian, so they would not dare to tell on him. It was fortunate that Mu Tai was brave enough to bring this up in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian gave a wry smile and drank all the wine in his cup. Fan Xizha's behavior had been strange lately, and as the older brother, he had not paid enough attention to him. He had scolded Ruoro and Wanner for no reason. He had not thought that in this world where men were superior to women, if Fan Xizha wanted to do something bad outside of the manor, how could they, as his sister and sister-in-law, interfere? As for the second prince's plans, Fan Xian was very clear. In the spring, his relationship with the second prince was not bad. Back then, the second prince had used the third prince and Fan Xizha to do this shady business. One, he wanted to earn more money, and the other, he did not necessarily want to do anything to the Fan manor. He simply wanted to use this little brothel to make the relationship between the two parties closer. The reason why he hid it from Fan Xian was because the second prince thought he was doing him a favor. In his previous life, there was the true meaning of a prostitute. What kind of relationship was it to open a brothel and greet a customer? If the two parties had such a deep relationship, it would not be easy to separate them. After Fan Xian returned to the capital, there had been a subtle change. It seemed that the second prince was surprised by this too. In the current situation, the Baoyu brothel, which was supposed to be used to deepen the relationship between the two parties, had become a rope that was forcefully twisted. If Fan Xian wanted to continue to touch the second prince, he would have to consider the existence of the Baoyu brothel. After all, Fan Xizha had played a very dishonorable role in it. Based on the evidence the Overwatch Council had found, it was enough to close down the brothel and charge Fan Xizha with a heavy crime. If this matter was exposed, even if the Fan family could escape the laws of the Qing kingdom, this would become a weakness for their enemies to attack. For Fan Xian and the Fan family, it would be difficult for them to bear the consequences. For Fan Xian, he was able to stand independently in the political arena. He knew that aside from his mysterious past, the reputation he had gained over the past 2 years was also an important factor. The Fan family and the third prince were working together to open a brothel. The other party had unabashedly poured dirty water on each other at the same time. As the saying goes, one prospers, one suffers, one suffers. One is beautiful, one is dirty. Fan Xian, who had always been a free and easy poet, was now worried. He could not care less about his own reputation, but he had to care about Fan Xizha's fate and his father's attitude. Chen Pingping had emphasized many times that he owed his father a lot. And from the looks of it, this matter was not difficult to solve. All he had to do was show some kindness, and the Baoyu brothel would be completely covered up in the capital. He would have enough time to deal with Fan Xizha's connection to this matter. All he had to do was reach out his hand and shake it. This seemed to be the simplest and most beneficial choice for both parties. But Fan Xian would not choose to shake hands with the second prince's outstretched black hand. Even if this hand represented peace, showed enough sincerity, and was careful enough in its posture, it was full of probing, and did not carry out any real provocation. This was because he could tolerate someone using his reputation to threaten him. But he could not tolerate someone using his brother to threaten him. No matter how resourceful the second prince was, he still overlooked a very important point. He was always used to judging things from the perspective of profit. He judged Fan Xian from the perspective of a court official. He forgot that there were many things that had long exceeded the scope of profit and loss. And Fan Xian was much more arrogant than a so-called official. Deng Ziyu had already safely boarded the carriage and left the Baoyu brothel. Fan Xian felt a little comforted. His brother was not so bad that he could not be saved. He silently put his hands behind his back and pushed open the door. He walked to the door of the room and gently pushed it open. He looked at the surprised people in the room and looked at the shocked and scared Fan Xian. His face was expressionless, and he quietly said, "Come home with me." Chapter 290. The Baowe brothel guard outside the door had already fainted. Fan Xian stood alone in the doorway, looking emotionlessly at his 14-year-old brother. At this point, the thugs and young men in the room came to their senses. Some of them did not know who Fan Xian was, and their faces showed signs of nervousness. The young man with the injured right hand recognized him as Mr. Chun from last night. He screamed and brought a few men with him, ready to rush forward. Fan Xian did not have time to think. He turned his hand around and smashed the teapot in his hand. There was a loud bang. The first thug to pass by Fan Xian received a heavy blow to the head. He grunted and fell to the ground. His head began to bleed. The teapot in Fan Xian's hand broke, and the steaming hot tea splashed all over his hand. On the floor, the man's body began to emit a white steam. His eyes looked at the doorway in fear. His right hand, which was holding the half-broken teapot, could not help but tremble. Even the tone of his voice changed. "Big brother, why are you here?" Fan Xian did not answer him, but the people in the room were all shocked. How could the big boss knock out his own man? Everyone looked at Fan Xian in shock. Only the young third prince looked at Fan Xian with an innocent look of confusion. Some of the more quick-witted people finally remembered what he had called Fan Xian, and from that, they knew who Fan Xian was. The reason the Baoyu brothel dared to be so arrogant was because of the big boss's big brother, Commissioner Fan of the Overwatch Council. Could it be that the young man in front of the door was Fan Xian's backer? Fan Xian? Fan Xian did not have the self-awareness of being the backer of a brothel. He looked down and asked, "Are we going back?" Fan Xian did not have time to think about what was about to happen to him. He gritted his teeth, and the fat on his cheeks trembled. After a while he said yes. He lowered his head and walked over to Fan Xian's side. He looked like a child who had done something wrong. Fan Xian tilted his head and looked at his little brother. He noticed that the little guy had grown quite a bit over the past 2 years. He was almost at the base of his ears. He sighed and coldly said, "First, you did something wrong. Second, you are not a child. So do not pretend to be pitiful in front of me." "Yes." Fan Xian groaned. Fan Xian ignored him. His cold gaze swept over the dozen or so people in the room. He found that some of them were the nobles who had appeared the night before. They had escaped, so Fan Xian had not broken their bones with his bare hands. He narrowed his eyes and found that there were a few faces that he could still recognize. He had a good memory, although the other party did not have the ability to recognize him. Since they already knew his identity, he could only humbly step forward and bow. "Greetings, big cousin." "Greetings, uncle." "Grandpa Xian." The major and minor shareholders of the Baoyu brothel walked up to Fan Xian in a pitiful manner and greeted him. Hearing these people introduce themselves, Fan Xian's heart was filled with anger and self-mockery. What the F***ck was going on? Investigating a case had led to the discovery of his own face. No wonder Sangwen said that carriages often came from Minister Ali. The people in front of him were all related to him. If they were not from the Fan family, then they were related to the Lu family. Fan Xian and the third prince were the leaders of this brothel. They had opened this brothel, so naturally, these people were related. He shook his head, and his chest was filled with anger. He wanted to throw these people, who he did not know where they had come from, into the thin lake behind the brothel. After a while, he suppressed the anger in his heart. He grabbed Fan Xian by the collar like he was carrying a little chick, and walked out of the secret room of the Baoyu brothel. Just as the two brothers were about to walk out of the room with flagging interest, the third prince seemed to have just come back to his senses. Revealing a sweet smile, he said with pleasant surprise, "Sir Fan Jr." "Oh, cousin." Fan Xian turned around and looked at the youngest prince. A gentle smile appeared on his face, and he said, "Third prince, don't ever try to act like a little kid in front of me. Also, I have no interest in talking to a little kid like you." Everyone was shocked. To call a prince a little kid in public. Fan Xian was the first person since the founding of the Qing kingdom. Everyone was shocked by Fan Xian's boldness, but they were also confused. No matter how much the emperor loved him, he was still an official. How could he be so disrespectful to a prince? The third prince stared at Fan Xian, and his lips trembled with anger. Fan Xian's smile was even sweeter, and he said, "That little mouth of yours is trembling." The third prince almost fainted from anger, but he remembered what his mother had said. When this big cousin smiled gently, it was when he was very unhappy. It was best not to provoke him. He gritted his teeth and did not say anything. It was in the afternoon, and there were not many customers in the Baoyu brothel. News of what happened upstairs had already spread, and many people rushed to the first floor. They were fortunate enough to see the eldest brother scold his son. At this time, everyone who knew the inside story knew that Mr. Chun, who had caused such a ruckus in the Baoyu brothel last night, was the famous young master Fan. Naturally, no one dared to step forward and cause trouble. They could only watch. The thugs and girls, who did not know what was going on, could not help but whisper to each other. There was a glimmer of excitement in their eyes, and they spread the news they had just received. Could it be that the little fatty, who was being held like a chicken, was the most mysterious boss of their brothel? No matter how they looked at him, he did not look like the vicious character that was rumored to be. And who was the beautiful young man holding the boss? Fan Xian walked forward, holding the boss of the Baoyu brothel. His face was expressionless, but he saw the girl named Yan in the corner. Her eyes seemed to be worried. He raised his eyebrows and his heart was moved. He knew that this matter had gotten out of hand, and he could not hide it from the people of the capital for long. But he did not intend to hide it. He had other plans. Walking out of the door of the Baoyu brothel, there was a carriage on each side of the quiet street. Fan Xian's carriage was on the west side, and the carriage on the east side had no markings. But the curtain was lifted, and Crown Prince Hong Chung revealed an apologetic face. His face had long since lost its usual brightness, and he greeted Fan Xian. The sun was moving toward the west, and the dusky light made one feel uncomfortable. It shone through the leaves of the autumn trees, and it shone on Fan Xian's face. He seemed to be pierced by the sun, and he squinted his eyes in annoyance. Tung Zijing appeared out of nowhere, and he said, "The master knows that the young master has something to discuss, and so he asked me to take the second young master back." Fan Xian did not turn around, and he nodded slightly. He then said, "In a moment, there will be people from the clan entering the manor. Tell the guards in the house to be on high alert. Do not let a single one of them slip out." He then looked at Fan Xizha, whose face was pale, and said, "If anyone dares to sneak out again, I will break their legs." Although his words were soft, they made those who heard them shudder. Tung Zijing could clearly feel the anger in the young master's heart, and he did not dare to be careless. He respectfully replied, "The master has spoken. You will deal with this matter yourself, young master. The manor will be closed today, and we will await your return." Fan Xian nodded, and walked toward Crown Prince Hongqing's carriage. Fan Xizha cried out "brother" behind him, but he received no response. He could only obediently get into the carriage. The two parties beside the carriage did not seem to be in the middle of some kind of negotiation or peace negotiation, but more like they were chatting. Fan Xian laughed lightly. "Why are you in such a hurry to take Miss Yuan back to the Jinghe River?" Hongqing laughed bitterly. "I didn't think Yuan Meng's matter could be hidden from you." Fan Xian replied, "You know what I do for a living. It's difficult to hide something like this from me." Li Hongqing moved slightly to the side, and invited him into the carriage. Fan Xian shook his head, and then he saw that in the spacious carriage, besides the well-endowed Yuan Meng, there was another person sitting there. That noble person was half-squatting on the seat, looking at Fan Xian with a warm and sincere gaze. Fan Xian's pupils shrank, but he immediately returned to normal. He smiled and cupped his hands in salute. "Greetings, Your Highness. Back in the spring, we weren't so distant." The second prince's thin lips moved slightly, and there was a look of pity in his clear eyes. He slowly said, "How did you suddenly become like this?" Fan Xian laughed. "Perhaps I don't know how to appreciate favors. The second prince was silent for a moment. After a while he said, "This is not a good place to talk. Master Fan, would it be possible for us to talk in detail?" Fan Xian's smile faded, and he shook his head. "I'm in a hurry to go home and deal with that useless child of mine. I don't have time. I'm just passing by." The second prince smiled at Fan Xian and said something that neither of them would believe. Whether or not the Baoyu brothel case was investigated had nothing to do with him. If Fan Xian wanted to investigate it, the Fan family would lose face and profit. If he did not investigate it, then that would be the best outcome. Everyone would be eating from the same bowl, and the Fan family would have to be more tolerant of him in the future when it came to politics. Although the second prince saw that the palace treasury was on the brink of collapse, he cared a great deal about the money that the brothel brought. But compared to whether or not he could win over Fan Xian, money was a small matter. Fan Xian sighed and said, "Investigating a case has led to my own family, and I've let the second prince watch a good show. What a joke." The second prince shook his head and sighed. "I can't laugh. The Baoyu brothel's business is too complicated. Although I didn't get involved, I know that aside from the third prince, at least 70% of the shares are in the hands of Fan Xija. You are brothers after all. If you can't, then let it go." The two of them were talking about something else, and they both knew what they were talking about. Where did he get the money to be a big boss? Fan Xian shook his head and smiled wryly. Hong Yigong's two grandsons also paid a lot of money. The second prince seemed to be kind enough to remind Fan Xian. Hong Yigong was in the Lu Manor. Fan Xian pretended to be surprised, and then sadly said, "It looks like we will have to stop investigating this case." The second prince knew that not investigating the case meant that Fan Xian was willing to make peace for the time being. He was happy, and the smile on his face was very genuine. He said, "Although everyone's status is different, we are all poor people who live in the capital. You are an important person in the manor, and you have to make decisions for your children." Fan Xian said, "I won't lie to you, Your Highness. I am not a pure official who is loyal to the law." He looked straight into the second prince's eyes and said, "Besides, Your Highness has calculated all the details. How can I not give in?" The second prince was shocked. He knew that Fan Xian was not a person who would show weakness. As expected, Fan Xian clapped his hands expressionless. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the Baoyu brothel behind the carriage. There was the sound of people and horses tumbling, tables and chairs falling to the ground, and the terrified screams of the girls in the brothel. Li Hongqing's face changed. He didn't know how many people Fan Xian had arranged for the first bureau of the Overwatch Council to be placed in the Baoyu brothel. His face was full of worry, and he said, "Nji, to be honest, even if you make this a hard case, you can't hurt us. Why go through all this trouble?" Hongqing was a very direct person, Fan Xian thought, and a self-mocking look flashed in his eyes. Seeing that he was still 1,000 miles away, no matter how much self-control the second prince had, his heart gradually grew cold. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "It is just some children's business. Xija and the third prince had nothing to do, so they set up a brothel to play. Don't take it too seriously." Fan Xian knew that the business of the Baoyu house was far from enough to deal a blow to a prince. Furthermore, the handsome second prince in front of him had nothing to do with this brothel. If he started with Yuan Meng, he would only be able to get Hongqing involved. If he really wanted to investigate further, he would only end up hurting his own hand. "Xija is my little brother. I will think about how to discipline him." He looked back at the second prince. "But you have to discipline your own brother." Hongqing finally couldn't help but shake his head and say, "Nji, you must not misunderstand this. The business of the Baoyu brothel was indeed done by those two kids. I know Yuan Meng came to help, but the second prince and I did not interfere." Fan Xian shook his head and said, "Sometimes not interfering and just watching is a very clever move." He looked at Hongqing with a not quite there smile and said, "And I do not believe Fan Xija has the ability to investigate the relationship between you and Yuan Meng." The raid continued, and the Baoyu brothel was still in a state of chaos. The second prince frowned and thought, is Fan Xian really so cold-hearted? To protect his own reputation and attack him, Fan Xian didn't even care about the life and death of his own brother and his family. Fan Xian guessed what he was thinking, and with a self-mocking expression, he looked at the second prince and said, "Your Highness, your calculations are flawless. I do not dare investigate the Baoyue brothel. After all, I cannot personally send Fan Xizha to the capital government." As long as the two sides could maintain their current peace, then the Fan and Lu families, as well as the people involved in the Baoyue brothel, would not have to face the pressure of the capital government. Even Fan Xian himself thought the second prince had played a beautiful hand. The price he asked for was not too high. After a long time, Fan Xian looked at Mu Fenger, who was far away, making a secret gesture. He knew he had not copied out the account books of the Baoyue brothel, but he never expected to do so. Fan Xizha, that little rascal, was being blackmailed by the second prince. Fan Xizha only knew how to be an unscrupulous businessman, but he did not know that the buttocks of a businessman were always being watched by officials. The second prince finally understood what Fan Xian wanted to do. He smiled and thought, Fan Xizha was the owner of the Baoyue brothel, and there is no way Fan Xian can clear his name. The Fan and Lu families are both caught up in this. If you do not want to make a big deal out of this, you will have to make peace with yourself. The Baoyue brothel will continue to operate. Fan Xian continued to speak calmly. Your Highness, you should understand what I mean. The second prince nodded to show his agreement, but deep in his heart, he felt a strong sense of unease. He knew that Fan Xian was not easy to control, and he would not allow himself to be tied down by a brothel. He did not know what Fan Xian would do next. Fan Xian's tone changed, and he said, Hongcheng, this is not right. You were sleeping outside, and I did not have the heart to tell Ruoro about it. I hoped that after your marriage, you would be more restrained. But how could you know that Xizha was doing such a shady business, and yet you did not tell us? Even if I was not in the capital at the time, could you not have told Ruoro? After all, in a few days, you will be Xizha's brother-in-law. He looked at the prince and said, Hongcheng, you have disappointed me. The second prince was silent. No matter how smart he was, there was no way he could detect the hidden meaning behind Fan Xian's words. Even Li Hongcheng felt guilty. He did not know what Fan Xian was planning to do with this incident, or what ulterior motives he had to achieve. The search of the Baoyue brothel continued, and the second prince thought, if you have agreed to make peace, why do you still want to search? He was worried that the black dogs of the Overwatch Council would discover the relationship between Hongcheng and the brothel, and so he frowned and said, Mr. Fan, can you tell your men to stop? After all, this is the business of the capital government. The Overwatch Council interfering with government affairs is something that the Emperor has forbidden. Fan Xian smiled and said, Your Highness, I am only following orders from my family to come to this brothel and take back a few of my useless relatives. Of course, I have used the men of the First Bureau, which is a private use, but the officials of the court often call on their subordinates to help them move houses, and my subordinates only know how to fight. Asking them to help me capture a few of my relatives is not a big deal. The second prince was angry. Fan Xian had used the word relative, and he did not know what to say. In the Baoyue brothel behind the carriages, the noise gradually died down. The disguised officers of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council pulled out 7 or 8 people. These people were all relatives of the Fan and Lu families, and they were deeply involved in the Baoyue brothel. Their faces looked defeated. At the very back of the group, there was a young man with a vicious face. He had been beaten down the stairs, and his body was covered in wounds. It was the young man who had wanted to kill Fan Xian the night before. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and gazed at his terrified relatives. Through gritted teeth he said coldly, Send them back to the manor. He turned to the second prince and softly said, Do not worry, Your Highness. What I promised you I will do. But these people are mine. It is not convenient to use the laws of the Qin kingdom to investigate them, so I will have to use the family rules to deal with them. The second prince thought to himself, No matter how you use the family rules, you cannot hide the fact that the Fan family owns the shares of the Baoyue brothel. You will not have a falling out with me. and I will let you vent your anger on your own." The second prince looked at the people of the Fan and Lu families, and his heart trembled. He did not know what kind of family rules Fan Xian was going to use to deal with them. Fan Xian looked into his eyes and suddenly said, "The people who ambushed me last night, I would like to trouble you to pass on a message. From now on the streets of the capital, do not let me see them again. Yes, that is all." Chapter 291. The first bureau of the Overwatch Council dealt with the looting of the building very appropriately. They only arrested those who were related to the Fan and Lu families. The little bastards from the Duke's manor had been beaten by Fan Xian and had been sent home to recover from their wounds. They also did not have the right to get too involved, so none of them were arrested. After Uncle Mu and Uncle Mu had arrested the people, they did not say anything to Commissioner Fan, who was standing next to the carriage. They took the young men back to Fan Manor. The people of the Overwatch Council saw Fan Xian stand outside the carriage for a long time and did not go in. The people in the carriage did not come out either, and they knew that the person in the carriage was someone more important than Fan Xian. Fan Xian was a member of the royal family, so the person in the carriage must be someone close to the royal family. The looting of the building did not yield any results. Fan Xian wanted to destroy the accounts of Fan Xija and the Baoyu brothel, but that was an impossible task. Because of this, he was forced to maintain a temporary peace with the second prince. Investigating the Baoyu brothel was a stupid thing to do. The people of the Overwatch Council left, and the people of the capital government came to keep the peace. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. The Fan and Lu families still owned 70% of the shares of the Baoyu brothel, and they continued to be the infamous prostitutes of the capital. Commissioner Fan and the second prince were having a very intimate conversation. It seemed that the capital was about to be at peace. The second prince, who was in the carriage, looked at Fan Xian's calm face, and he could not help but feel a little admiration for him. What happened with the Baoyu brothel was enough to make most people angry, but Fan Xian was calm. He accepted his suggestion of peace without any hesitation. He was a very good judge of the situation, and he was brave enough to make decisions. Every time he saw that familiar smile on Fan Xian's face, he felt a sense of unease and familiarity in the depths of his heart. He always felt that Fan Xian was someone very similar to himself. Although Fan Xian was an official, he still had a strong urge to have a deep conversation with him. "Hongcheng, you go first. I have some private things to discuss with Mr. Fan," the second prince said coldly. He paid no attention to the eyes of the people on the street and slowly walked down from the carriage. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. He was surprised by the other party's action. Just now, he had clearly said that he was going back to the manor and did not want to have a deep conversation. However, the other party was a prince and had personally come out of the carriage to invite him. Even if he was not giving him face, he still wanted to hear what he wanted to say. So he gently nodded. Li Hongcheng looked at him apologetically. He and the carriage left the Baoyu brothel, a place of trouble. The second prince's embroidered shoes stepped onto the street. He couldn't resist stretching. Amidst the whispers of the crowd in the distance, he led Fan Xian into a tea shop. A servant had already cleared the tea shop. Only he and Fan Xian sat facing each other. Fan Xian picked up the bowl and took a sip. He raised his eyebrows in surprise and glanced at the second prince. The second prince smiled and said, "I know you like this. Every time you go to Hongqing Manor, you ask for some sour berries to drink." He then warmly said, "Brother Fan must hate me for what happened at the Baoyu brothel." Fan Xian slightly raised his lips and said, "I am not a saint. Naturally, I have emotions." The second prince shook his head and said, "In the beginning, when your second brother and my third brother discussed doing business, I already knew about it. I even secretly helped." He looked at Fan Xian's face and said, "But do not misunderstand. At that time, the court and the capital all thought the Fan family was on good terms with me. I did not have the intention to threaten you. I only wanted to find a place of mutual benefit for both sides and make our relationship closer. Who would have thought that it would become a dirty trick? It was not what I wanted." Fan Xian had already guessed the second prince's thoughts when he built the Baiwa brothel in the spring, so he was not surprised. But hearing him admit to using dirty tricks, he did not know how to respond. He smiled and said, "Your Highness, you really do have a lot of respect for me." The second prince was not afraid to continue this topic. He lightly said, "I have always valued you. You should know that. So, I do not understand why, after you returned to the capital, you would target me." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Your Highness's words are a bit muddled. I am only an official. What good would it do me to target your Highness?" The second prince stared into his eyes and slowly said, "I need you to tell me. I know, you would not be willing to be a pawn of the crown prince, so I really do not understand." He had not thought that this prince would be so open and honest. Fan Xian felt a bit surprised. Shortly after, a clear smile rose to his face. He quietly said, "Your Highness, you really do not understand?" The second prince looked into his eyes and gently shook his head. Fan Xian slightly tilted his head and used his knuckles to knock on the surface of the wooden table. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Newlon Street." The second prince was silent. A moment later he said, "This is my fault." Having said this, he stood up and bowed deeply toward Fan Xian. As the emperor's own son, he bowed and apologized to an official. Fan Xian did not show the expression that the second prince had hoped to see. He sat on the chair like a piece of ice, squinting at him. "Your Highness is your Highness," he said quietly. "An official is an official. This is a matter of life and death. Perhaps your Highness thinks that by personally apologizing, you have already given me enough of an explanation, and that I, as an official, should be moved to tears and feel a sense of belonging to the nation?" The second prince took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the anger that had not appeared in his heart for many years. He coldly said, "Then, Master Fan, how can you repair the relationship between us?" Fan Xian suddenly laughed and said, "Actually, in the last round of investigation, you know why? Who told my mother-in-law to always dislike me as a son-in-law? One moment he was an assassin, the next he was from the imperial censorate, and next year, I will be taking over the palace treasury. I cannot avoid conflict with Xinjiang. If your Highness is willing to promise me one thing, I cannot guarantee that I will be biased. But at least in the capital, I will have the Overwatch Council maintain a relatively fair attitude." The second prince's heart trembled slightly. The sliver of negative emotion that had been lingering in his chest earlier had long disappeared. During these few months, his people and officials in court had been closely watched by the Overwatch Council, including the imperial astronomer and the others. They had all met with great misfortune, giving the entire second prince's faction a headache. Now that he heard Fan Xian say that he could change the Overwatch Council's attitude, how could he not be tempted? After a moment of silence, he stretched out his right hand and very gently said, "Please speak, Commissioner." This sentence used an official title. Fan Xian looked at him and smiled. "Your Highness, if you can keep your distance from the eldest princess, I promise you a lifetime of peace." The second prince was startled. He had never thought that Fan Xian would make such an absurd suggestion. Promise him a lifetime of peace? How arrogant and daring. He finally couldn't hold back his depression. In a cold voice he said, "Commissioner Fan, are you playing with me?" The two young nobles, who did not actually look alike, but their temperaments and auras were very similar, sat across from each other at a table, and did not see eye to eye. Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Your Highness has many questions, and I also have many questions. Is this dragon chair really so easy to sit on? Is peace not a rare blessing? Your Highness has always liked literature, and Lady Shu is also a clear-minded person like snow. How can you not see through the crux of this?" Even though there was no one in the tea shop at this moment, and there was no need to worry that this conversation would be overheard by others, suddenly hearing Fan Xian speak his mind so plainly, the second prince's heart still trembled uncontrollably. There were many things in this world that could only be done and not said. For example, no matter how much he wanted to take the throne, he was still incomparably respectful to the crown prince. Who would have thought that this person in front of him would say it so lightly? It was not until today that the second prince truly understood the extent of Fan Xian's courage. He also became more and more unclear as to what Fan Xian was relying on. A dim light flashed through the second prince's eyes. This dim light was touched by Fan Xian's words. Years of pain finally began to burn. Staring at Fan Xian's face, he lowered his voice and said coldly, "Everyone knows that the dragon chair is not easy to sit on. But I am in the emperor's home, and I have no choice. If I want to take this chair, I can take it. If I don't want it, I still have to take it. If I have the freedom to choose, I would rather go to the Imperial College and study every day than get mixed up in this matter." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly. "Is someone forcing you?" Perhaps Fan Xian's boldness had aroused a trace of bloodlust, and the second prince laughed coldly. "Of course someone is forcing me. From the time I was 12, they said that I was virtuous, and that it would be a waste to be a prince. When I was 13, they made me a king. When I was 14, they built a manor outside the palace. On the surface, it seemed like they were chasing me out of the palace, but in reality, they gave me the opportunity to freely submit to the officials. When I was 15, they let me enter the royal study to listen to state affairs. Did you know? Before me, only the crown prince had such an opportunity." The second prince's handsome face gradually twisted. "I don't want to fight. But these things are coming out one by one. What can I do? Does the Eastern Palace think that I don't want to fight for the throne?" The crown prince was young at the time, but he looked at me with such hatred in his eyes. "We are brothers. When he was only 13, he already wanted to kill me. Even if I can convince the crown prince, what about the empress? Will she let me go?" Fan Xian was silent, listening to the second prince's madness. It was he who pushed me into this position. The second prince's eyes were like a cold fire sealed in ice, making people shiver. "I want to protect my mother. I want to protect my life. What should I do? Since he wants me to fight, then I'll fight for him." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. He knew that the only one who had the power to force a prince onto the road of fighting for the throne was the emperor himself. He smiled slightly and said, "But have you ever thought that maybe he is just using you as a stone, a whetstone to force the crown prince to mature?" "I knew that a long time ago." The second prince coldly waved his sleeve. "We are both favored by the heavens. Who would be willing to be a whetstone that will break in the future? So I have to keep fighting. If I really do win, I will be happier to see him regret than sitting on that chair." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Why vent your resentment on such a matter? The great prince has already been made a prince, but he seems to know a lot more than the second prince. If someone wants to push you into the river to compete in swimming, your best resistance is to fight to the death and not enter the river. At most, you can turn around and fight with the person behind you. It's not to go into the river and strangle your opponent to death." The second prince finally calmed down. He looked at Fan Xian with shock. "Your words sound like rebellion." Fan Xian shook his head indifferently. "The treasonous things your highness said today are no less than mine." The second prince's eyebrows suddenly jumped. He looked at Fan Xian. A moment later he suddenly said, "Help me, Fan Xian." Fan Xian shook his head calmly, even coldly. "Why?" The second prince quietly said, "In the future, you will have to choose someone." Fan Xian did not answer him. He only thought, based on blood relations, this person in front of him should be his brother. He was different from other officials. He did not want to make a choice. He was just a little shocked by the Qing kingdom's ruthless way of teaching, and he gradually grew afraid. Seeing the second prince's sincere gaze, Fan Xian finally opened his mouth and said, "Do not get too close to Xinyang. That woman is a very talented madwoman. I don't know what she is thinking." The second prince calmed down. He smiled and sat down. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He knew that although the second prince was tempted by his power, he still trusted the eldest princess's power more. But this was good. At least in the future, when he was dealing with the second prince in front of him, his heart would be a little harder. "I still don't want to be your enemy," the second prince said seriously. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He suddenly raised his head and said, "Even if the Baiwa brothel incident did not happen, I would still beat you down to the ground." A mocking look flashed through the second prince's eyes. It seemed that he thought Fan Xian's arrogance had gone too far. Fan Xian ignored his look and coldly said, "Perhaps this is the only way for you and Hongqing to survive." The second prince heard the pity and disdain in Fan Xian's voice, and he was furious. He suddenly stood up and stared coldly into Fan Xian's eyes. Fan Xian mockingly said, "Your Highness, do not ever think that you can control everything. That includes the Baiwa brothel." The atmosphere in the tea shop suddenly became cold. 8 people slowly walked in from outside the shop. They were all wearing the same clothes, but it was impossible to tell how old they were. Every single one of them had a murderous aura hidden deep within their bodies. Some were like a knife, some were like a sword, and some were like a giant axe that could split open a mountain. Fan Xian knew that the second prince would not choose to kill him in the busy market. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the 8 people who had walked into the tea shop from who knew where. In a quiet voice he said, "The 4 generals Gan Lu, Xie and Fan, the 4 gentlemen He, Zhang, Su and Chao, the legendary 8 generals under the second prince's command. So this is what they look like." The second prince looked at him and said, "Fan Xian, I value you, but that does not mean I must need you. So do not be too arrogant." Fan Xian stood up and smiled as he waved his hand. He said, "The Qinian unit under my command cannot beat the 8 people under your command, so I will not make a fool of myself. But there is something that I must say. Your Highness, no matter how many people you have, it is useless for the bigger picture. Otherwise, Chen Pingping would have become emperor a long time ago." Amidst his laughter, he threw down his last rebellious sentence and left the tea house in a carefree manner. When he walked out of the shop, he seemed to casually pass through the 8 most capable family warriors of the second prince. He only slightly shrugged his shoulders in front of the Gan and Xie generals and waved his hand in front of the Su and Chao princes. A faint breath of air came into contact with the murderous aura of the 8 people that had yet to be released. In an instant, it spread along the wooden pillars of the tea shop and mixed with the autumn afternoon sunlight outside the tea shop. There was no trace of it anymore. A moment after Fan Xian left, the second prince rested his chin on the table and furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't know why he had suddenly lost his composure in front of Fan Xian and said many things that had been hidden in the depths of his heart. He took a deep breath, and a glimmer of seriousness flashed across his handsome face. In a cold voice he said, "If there is a day in the future when you need to kill him, how many people do you need?" Xie Baiyan slowly put the sheathed sword back into his white sleeve and said woodenly, "I alone will be enough." Fan Wujia's face was dark, and he shook his head slightly. He said, "Even if the 8 generals were to come together, they might not be able to keep Sir Fan Jr." The second prince was a little lost in thought. He thought that even the 8 generals did not care about Fan Xian's words. This Fan Xian was a character that he could not see through. But then he remembered that after the Baiwa brothel incident, Fan Xian would not make a move against him for a while. He shook his head and stopped thinking about it. Sitting in the carriage, Fan Xian carefully used water to wash away the faint fragrance that remained on his fingers. He was a little disappointed with the conversation. Although he had taken a great risk to draw out some of the second prince's thoughts, there was no useful information. He still did not understand the arrangements between him and the eldest princess. It looked like the second prince was a person with a calm mind and a scholarly spirit. But he was not a caring sister, so there was no point in knowing these things. The carriage arrived at Fan Manor. He jumped down from the carriage and calmly walked through the corner door. He quickly walked to the back garden, ignoring the confused faces of the Fan and Lu family members. He went straight to the study room, pushed open the door with his steady hands, and then kicked it open. Inside the study room, there was a scream. Under the horrified gazes of the entire family, Fan Xija, who had no idea what had happened, was kicked into a ball and smashed into the armchair, breaking it into several pieces. Chapter 292. Fan Manor was now divided into 2 residences, one front and one back. The courtyard was luxurious, and the house was spacious. There were 3 study rooms, and the one where the scream had come from was on the west side, next to the garden. It was the least guarded of the 3, And it was also the one the servants were closest to. The sudden scream, like that of a pig being slaughtered, shocked everyone in the garden. After Fansia's scream, two women's screams immediately rang out in the study room. Fan Ruoro and Lin Wonner's faces lost all color. They stepped forward and grabbed Fan Xian's arm, afraid that their husband, or brother, would get angry and kick Fansia to death. In the eyes of these two women, Fan Xian had always been a gentle, refined, mature and steady young man. Even though there were times when he was unhappy, he had never shown such a violent side. Seeing the frost on Fan Xian's face, the two women couldn't help but shiver. They didn't know what Fansia had done to make him so angry, but they still held on to Fan Xian's arm, not letting him step forward. After Fansia had been dragged back to Fan Manor by Tung Zijing, he was as anxious as a cat on a hot tin roof. With great difficulty, he finally found an empty spot. He begged Cici, who was passing by the study room, to secretly send a message to his sister-in-law and sister, asking them to come quickly. Fan Ruoro and Lin Wonner didn't know what had happened. After entering the study room, they heard Fansia's cries for help, and even joked with him a little. Now, seeing Fan Xian's vicious kick to the heart, they knew that things had gotten out of hand. Their faces paled, and they looked at Fan Xian's angry face with a hint of fear. "Let go." The words that came out of Fan Xian's mouth seemed to have been soaked in ice for an entire night. They were cold and carried with them a cold wind. "Father already knows of this matter. No one can stop me. I won't beat him to death." Fansia lay on the ground, pretending to be dead. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that his brother's expression was calm, and that he wouldn't kill him. He let out a sigh of relief. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian continued coldly, "I'm going to cripple him." As he spoke, he easily extricated himself from the two girls' tight grip. In his anger, he didn't have time to find the family rules. He directly grabbed the teacup on the desk and threw it at Fansia's face. With a loud crash, the teacup smashed right next to Fansia's head. Hot tea and broken porcelain splattered everywhere. Fansia cried out in pain as his face was scratched with blood. He no longer dared to lie on the ground and pretend to be dead. He jumped up and hid behind Wonner, crying and howling, "Sister-in-law. Brother wants to kill me. Help." Lin Wonner looked at the blood on her brother-in-law's face and jumped in fright. She quickly shielded him behind her and blocked the angry Fan Xian in front of her. She hurriedly said, "What happened? What was going on? Can't we talk things out?" Fan Xian looked at Fansia's sorry state, hiding behind Wonner, but he didn't soften at all. Thinking of all the dirty things Fansia had done, he became even angrier. He pointed at him and scolded, "Ask him what he did." Fansia was about to open his mouth to explain, but he felt a sweetness in his chest. He almost spat out blood. He knew how hard his brother's kick had been, and for a moment he was scared half to death. He didn't know if he was going to die like that. In his terror, he gathered his courage and jumped up. He screamed, "I just opened a brothel. Is there a need to be so desperate? Sister-in-law, I can't live, ah." After letting out a blood-curdling scream, Fansia fell to the ground. Wonner and Ruoro were shocked. They quickly squatted down, rubbed their chests and pinched their nostrils. By this time, Fan Xian had already vented some of his anger. Seeing that the kid was pretending to be dead, he was so angry that he laughed. He then looked at the open door of the study. There were servants in the garden watching from afar. He closed the door behind him and said expressionlessly, "That kick didn't kill you. Get up." Fansia saw that he was going to be ruthless, so he didn't dare to get up. He could only hide behind his sister-in-law and sister, hoping to stall until his mother arrived. Fan Xian had already sat behind the desk. His face was expressionless, but no one knew what he was thinking. Ruoro carefully handed him a cup of tea. She asked quietly, "What brothel?" Fan Xian slowly sipped the tea in his cup. He closed his eyes and coldly said, "A brothel." Wanu and Ruoro were shocked again. The two girls had been scared a lot today, but compared to Fan Xian's kick to the heart, Fansia's brothel was a bit absurd, but it didn't bother them too much. In the capital, most of the children of the rich and powerful had some secret business dealings. Although it wasn't very glamorous in Fansia, He was young, but did he really have to be this angry? Fan Xian coldly laughed. He pulled out the Overwatch Council's investigation of the Baoyu brothel. He threw it to his sister. Fan Ruoro's face was full of confusion. She took it and looked at it. The file was not very long, but it clearly stated the history of the Baoyu brothel. The evidence was clear, and there was no way to explain it. It took her a while to finish reading it. Her hair was a mess, and a few strands of hair fell across her forehead. It covered her face and eyes, and it was impossible to see her reaction or expression. But gradually, Ruoro's breathing became heavy. It was clear that she was angry and sad. Her lower lip sank into her mouth, and it looked like she was gritting her teeth. Lin Wanner watched this scene with curiosity. She wanted to know what was written on the file, and she wanted to go next to her sister-in-law to look at it. But she was afraid that Fan Xian would take advantage of her absence and beat Fan Xizha to death. So she didn't dare move. Fan Ruoro slowly raised her head. Her face was calm, but the coldness between her eyebrows was very heavy. Her calm eyes were now filled with anger. She looked at Fan Xizha, who was hiding behind her sister-in-law and pretending to be dead. She gritted her teeth and asked, "Did you do all of this?" The tone of her question was calm, but underneath the calm surface, there was an undercurrent that made everyone in the room feel uneasy. Fan Xizha had been raised by his sister since he was a child. Compared to her, he was more afraid of this seemingly weak sister. He was also closer to Ruoro. Subconsciously, he slowly sat up and explained in a trembling voice, "Sister, what is it?" Fan Ruoro's face was full of sadness and disappointment. She wondered how her brother had become like this. Tears began to well up in her eyes. She gritted her teeth and threw the file at Fan Xizha. It landed right on Fan Xizha's face and said, "Look at it yourself." Fan Xizha looked at his brother, who was sitting calmly, and then looked at his sister-in-law. He picked up the file and continued to read. The more he read, the worse his face became. Brother knew what the Baoyu brothel had done. At this time, Fan Xian squinted his eyes and slowly stood up from his chair. Fan Xizha screamed and jumped up. He waved his hands and was scared to death. He tried to explain, "Brother, I didn't do this. Don't hit me anymore." Fan Xian squinted his eyes and looked at his brother. He coldly said, "Murder, arson, and forcing a girl to be a prostitute. If you were the one who did this, I would have kicked you to death. But who are you? You are the owner of the Baoyu brothel. Without your approval, would those bastards dare to do these things?" Fan Xizha's voice was trembling, and he said, "Some of these things were done by my brother. It had nothing to do with me." Fan Xizha, Fan Xizha. Fan Xian coldly laughed and said, "Ruoro said you were like a pig, and she was right. Do you think you can wash yourself clean like this? I've really underestimated you. You've actually become the leader of the small tyrants in the capital. You're really capable. You are so capable." Fan Xizha's heart grew colder and colder. Although he was young, his mind was sharp and ruthless. He knew that his brother wouldn't listen to his explanation, so he felt more and more wronged. With a long face he held, "It really has nothing to do with me." Right at this moment, he saw another scene that made his soul jump out of his body. Ruoro's face was calm. She pulled out a stick that was no longer than an arm, and handed it to Fan Xian. The first time Fan Xian came to the capital, Ruoro used a ruler to strike Fan Xizha's palm. The ruler was the Fan family's small family rule. What was the big family rule? It was a stick. It was a stick with thick thorns wrapped around it. It was a terrifying rod that could split open the flesh of the person being tortured with a single strike. In the entire Fan manor, there was only one person who was lucky enough to experience the big family rule. That person was once Count Sinan's most favored follower. He used the power of the Fan manor and Fan Jian's favor to cause trouble in the Ministry of Revenue. In the end, he was beaten down by Fan Jian with a stick. Now he was living in a manor outside the city. His leg was broken, and he was miserable. When Fan Xizha was educated as a child, he had seen the man's miserable state. Now seeing Fan Xian weighing the big family rule in his hand, he was scared silly. His mouth was wide open, but he couldn't say anything. Fan Xian walked out and coldly said to his wife and Ruoro, "I am responsible for this. You two cannot escape responsibility. Wanner silently retreated to the side and stood next to Roro. Fan Xija saw the stick coming closer and closer to him. In his terror, he stirred up the fierceness in his bones. He jumped up and pointed at Fan Xian's face. Sister-in-law, sister, don't listen to him. Brother, no. Fan Xian, don't act like a saint. What's wrong with me running a brothel? What's wrong with me being a tyrant? Who in the capital doesn't do the same? Why do you have to hit me? You think I don't know what you're thinking? It's just that you and the second prince don't get along, and I've dragged you in. You've lost face. So what? You want to take it out on me? You want to beat me to death? Fan Xija cried loudly. Beat me to death if you have the guts. What kind of brother are you? When I was doing business, how could I have known that you would fall out with the second prince? What does that have to do with me? You never told me. If you have the guts, then go beat up the third prince. You only know how to bully someone like me, who doesn't have a mother or father to care for him. What kind of guts are you? Aren't you the commissioner of the Overwatch Council? Go catch the capital's magistrate and beat up the third prince in the palace. Go, go. There was a light slap. Fan Xija's face had been slapped, which wasn't very loud. He woke up and looked at Fan Xian, who was getting closer and closer. After Fan Xian heard this nonsense, he was angry. Although he didn't show it on his face, the veins on his forehead were starting to show. In the 20 years since he was reborn, this was the first time he had been so angry. Most importantly, he had truly thought of Fan Xija as a brother. Who knew that he would do something like this and speak so eloquently? You shut up. He finally couldn't help but curse. If you want to do business, I'll let you do it. If you don't do evil, why would others dare to threaten me? Even if they did, am I the kind of person who would be threatened? I want to punish you today, not for anything else but because you deserve it. This has nothing to do with the second prince in the palace, and it has nothing to do with the third prince. Fan Xija, you need to understand that this is your business. Fan Xian was both sad and angry. You are so young, yet you act so ruthlessly. If I don't punish you, who knows what kind of trouble you will bring to father? I have expectations for you, so I won't allow you to continue down this path. Who cares about the second prince and the third prince? I am angry at you, and I hate you. They are not my brothers, you are my brother. He stared into his brother's eyes and said coldly, I have investigated clearly. Fortunately, you were not personally involved in those matters, so you can still be saved. Since you have gone down the wrong path, I will use my stick to help you correct it. As soon as he finished speaking, the stick came down. Under the great discipline, Fan Xija's trousers were torn and blood flowed everywhere. Finally, he let out a heart-wrenching howl. The sound quickly spread throughout the Fan manor, startling the servants and maids in the garden, as well as Teng Zijing and Deng Ziyu's subordinates. It also frightened the children of the Fan and Lu families, who were waiting in the garden. Naturally, it also made some people feel incomparably distressed. The screams of the second young master of the Fan family reverberated throughout the garden. The sound was so shrill that no one could bear to hear it. Earlier, it had been accompanied by Fan Xija's fierce resistance. Later, it became a cry for mercy. Then it became a pitiful cry for help. Finally, the voice gradually became softer. Amidst the weak cries, one could hear the 14-year-old calling for his mother. Master, Xija's really going to be beaten to death. Lu Shi knelt in front of Minister Fan, her face streaked with tears, and hugged his legs. Go and talk to Fan Xian, and make him stop. This is enough of a lesson. What if he really dies? Chapter 293. The beautiful Lady Lu had always maintained an air of nobility in Fan Manor. But today, she no longer cared about her appearance or her temperament. Her face was pale, and she could not bear it. She hugged her master's legs and cried, Master, please say something. Zhe is still young, he can't take such a beating. Minister Fan looked at the woman in front of him, and could not help but sigh. After the death of Fan Jian's first wife, Lady Lu had followed him. Back then, Fan Jian had been given the title of Count Sinan, but the emperor's favor was hidden in the shadows. Lady Lu was the granddaughter of the duke, and yet she had married him, a member of the Fan family. who knew how many people in the capital were shocked. After their marriage, Lady Lu took good care of him, caring for him, and forcibly pulled him back from Lujing River. So no matter how you looked at it, he had a feeling for Lady Lu, and he felt sorry for her. Furthermore, the person being beaten in that study was his own son. Minister Fan was not young anymore. How could he not feel sorry for him? But no matter what he was thinking, he maintained a good expression on his face. He shook his head and scolded. Jade that is not polished is worthless. It is the fault of the father that the child is not taught. A loving mother spoils the child. At that moment, there was another cry from the study. It was Fan Xija crying for his mother in pain. Fan Jian's eyebrows twitched and his heart twitched. He could no longer say the words of admonishment that he had been about to say. Lady Lu saw that her master had remained silent, and her tearful eyes showed her determination. She straightened her slightly disheveled dress and prepared to turn around and leave the study. Come back. Fan Jian scolded her in a low voice. Fan Xian is the eldest brother. It is only right for him to teach Xija a lesson. What will the child think if you run over now? What will the child think? Lady Lu turned around, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, you only think about what Fan Xian thinks, but not what I think. I only have one precious son. Do you have the heart to watch him be beaten to death? She bit her lower lip and cried hoarsely. That's right, I did make mistakes in the past. But after he came from Danzhou, I tolerated everything and was careful and cautious, afraid that he would be unhappy. Based on what you said, I went around trying to bribe the nobles in the capital, afraid that I would drag the young master down. After all, his position in the capital is partly due to me. Of course, as a mother, it is natural for me to do these things, and I would not go to him to ask for credit. But what is happening now? How could he bear to be so heavy-handed? If he still remembers what happened back then, I'll just return this life to him. Don't touch my son. My son. Fan Jian looked at Lady Lu's sobbing appearance, and a wave of anger rose to his chest. He scolded. What is this? Do you not know what kind of person Fan Xian is? Since he has let go of this matter, he will not pick it up again. Although he is young, he has a big heart. Xija went too far with what he did. If you don't teach him a lesson, he will drag the whole family down with him in the future. Will you be satisfied with that? Lady Lu was not an ordinary woman, and now that she knew the Baoyu brothel had been raided, she immediately knew that this had something to do with the struggle between the young master of the Fan family and the second prince. She wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes and said, It was not a big deal. It was just that the second prince had a hold on it, and that is why Fan Xian is angry. This woman and her son had the same judgment about Fan Xian's anger. Fan Jian's face darkened, and he said, Not a big deal? It's not like you didn't see the things that were sent to the study in the back. Xija is so young, and yet he is so ruthless. Although he did not do it himself, what difference does it make? Do you think your son has to do it himself for it to be a big deal? Lady Lu couldn't help but speak up for her son, and she said, Isn't there a lot of things like this in the capital? Who hasn't had this kind of trouble? Before she could finish, Fan Jian cut her off and coldly said, Don't talk about this anymore. Madame Lu obediently stopped talking, but the tear stains at the corners of her eyes had disappeared. Her eyes were still brimming with tears. The cries of pain and agony from the distant study gradually subsided. Instead, it made her, as his mother, even more frightened. Had Jur fainted or something? Fan Jian looked at her and couldn't help but sigh. He thought about what he had discussed with Fan Xian the night before, and his heart felt a little dark. In fact, over the past few months, Fan Xian had heard of Fan Xija's business in the capital, but he didn't care much about it. He thought it was a child's business, and what could he do? He didn't expect that even as a father, he had underestimated Fan Xija's abilities and methods. Let Fan Xian handle it. Fan Jian comforted Lady Lu and said, You should understand this. The more he doesn't try to avoid suspicion, the more it shows that he really sees Xija as his own brother. That child Fan Xian can even smile at his enemies. The reason why he is so tyrannical today is because he loves Xija. If it wasn't someone close to him, he would have just killed him. Why would he be so angry? Now that you understand this, you should be at ease. To tell you the truth, you know very well who our family can rely on in the future. Lady Lu understood this, of course. Fan Xian's reputation was too great, and they were riding a tiger. They could only go up, but not down. Fan Jian was getting on in years. He might not leave this world, but there would come a day when he would retire. Whether it was Lady Lu or Xija, what kind of fortune they would have, and whether or not this manor would be safe for the rest of their lives, all depended on how the young master of the manor did in this country. But no matter what, Lady Lu would always feel some resentment towards Fan Xian. Fan Jian shook his head and motioned for her to follow him out of the study. They walked towards the study next to the garden in the back of the manor. Lady Lu was overjoyed and hurriedly followed. Even the servant girls behind her, who were holding hot towels, didn't care to discipline them and waved them away. Turning here and there, the servants could only watch as their master and mistress walked through the manor so quickly. They couldn't help but feel a little surprised. But then they thought of the pig being slaughtered that came from the front and back of the manor. They suddenly understood and began to feel uneasy. They thought that the young master had beaten the second young master so badly. If the master and mistress hurried over, wouldn't they start a fight? Things had been going smoothly for Fan Xian for the past few years, and the atmosphere in the manor had been very serious and lively. The servants had a strong sense of belonging, and they really didn't want anything to happen in the manor. Lady Lu hurried towards the garden with a face full of panic. She wanted to grow a pair of wings and fly over, but seeing her master's calm and broad back as usual, she didn't dare to be first. Just as she reached the entrance to the garden, which connected the front and back of the manor, she heard another wretched cry from the garden. The sound of countless wooden planks falling on flesh rang out, and it was a frightening sound. Lady Lu's mind was in a mess. Suddenly hearing this sound, she couldn't tell if it was her precious son who was crying. A wave of sadness rose up in her chest, and with a cry, she fainted. Fortunately, the servant girls behind her didn't dare to leave because of her rebuke. They followed behind her obediently, and only then were they able to support the trembling mistress. The quietest of the 3 study rooms was in a secluded place next to the rockery. It was where Fan Xian conducted his household affairs, and it had always been forbidden for servants to approach. At this moment, there were 3 people sitting in the study. Sitting behind the desk was Sir Yin Jr., who had just been appointed to the 4th Bureau, Yin Bingyan. Sitting to his right was Fan Xian's student, Shi Chanli, and the bookkeeper of the 1st Bureau, Mu Tai. Aside from Tung Zijing and Deng Ziyu, who were supervising the execution in the garden, these 3 were Fan Xian's confidants. Yin Bingyan's position was naturally the most special. He was Fan Xian's superior, and they had a faint friendship. At this moment, he frowned as he listened to the clattering of the wooden planks in the garden. He couldn't help but shake his head. Something that should be sent to the capital government should not be punished at home. It is against the law of the Qing kingdom. It is against the law of the Qing kingdom. Among the 3 of them, only he dared to question Fan Xian's decision. Shi Chanli laughed and explained to Sir Yin Jr., "We can't make a big deal out of this right now. If we really do send this to the capital government, and they find out that the second young master, and the one in the palace, there will be no turning back. The commissioner will have to fight the second prince. But regardless of whether he wins or loses, the second young master of the Fan family will not have a good ending. Based on the evidence that the capital government has, even if they don't sentence him to death, they will at least send him 3,000 miles south." Mu Tai smiled awkwardly, not daring to respond. After all, he was the one who had warned Fan Xian about the Baoyu brothel. In other words, he was the one who had caused the second young master of the Fan family to end up like this. Although Fan Xian was very pleased with his performance, who knew what the majority of the Fan family thought? Yin Bingyan shook his head again. It was clear that he didn't approve of Fan Xian's decision to use the family law to replace the national law. But he also knew that this was the only thing he could do. He couldn't help but mock him and say, "This commissioner of ours, he really is a man with a crystal heart. Even if the Baoyu brothel case comes to light in the future, he will have something to say in front of the emperor." At least if the second prince wants to investigate the Fan family for not being strict enough and allowing his brother to commit murder, it will be impossible. Sir Chanli was shocked to hear this. He knew that Fan Xian had made this punishment known to the entire manor in order to get the news out and shut the mouths of the imperial censors. But Fan Xizha had committed a crime, and this was not going to work. Yan Bingyun smiled and looked at him, knowing what he was worried about. He said, "Don't worry about it. Your teacher has already made arrangements." Sir Chanli thought to himself that this matter had nothing to do with the Fourth Bureau. If Fan Xian was summoned here, then he must have made some sort of arrangement. But it wasn't convenient for him to continue asking. Mu Tai walked to the window and looked at the garden from afar. His buttocks were shaking, and his flesh was split open, and blood was spilled. Even though he was an official of the Overwatch Council, he couldn't help but be shocked by Fan Xian's ruthlessness. Seeing the children of the Fan and Lu families suffering under the punishment, he couldn't help but touch his own buttocks. Sir Chanli once again busied himself with copying some documents that he was about to use. Lady Lu woke up and was about to fight Fan Xian to the death. She rubbed her eyes and realized that the people being beaten in the garden were her good-for-nothing relatives. Although the punishment was cruel, and blood was splashing high into the air, and the children were crying out in pain, as long as it wasn't her own children suffering, Lady Lu had no objections. She returned to her noble and dignified demeanor as Lady Fan, and looked at the scene coldly. In the woman's heart, her son Fan Xizha was capable of causing trouble on a small scale, but he had stirred up so many scandals in the capital. It was obvious that he had been seduced by evil spirits. The children and nephews of her maternal family, the members of the Fan clan, were naturally the main culprits. The more she watched, the angrier she became. Ignoring the cries for help from her maternal relatives, she gritted her teeth and yelled at Teng Zijing's bodyguards. "The young master told you to hit them, so hit them hard. If you don't cure these little bastards, how can you vent your anger?" As they spoke, the couple entered the study. As soon as they saw Fan Xizha lying on the bench in the corner of the room, his lower body naked, Madame Lu immediately panicked and threw herself at him. She looked at the bloody marks on her son's back and buttocks with heartache. She couldn't help but quietly cry. Her fingers carefully stroked the swollen bruises from the rod. "My son!" A hand reached out with a handkerchief to wipe away the tears on her face. Lady Lu looked and saw that it was Fan Xian. She gritted her teeth. She didn't show any resentment, but she still couldn't help but feel a hidden bitterness. Fan Xian had already regained his composure. After the vicious beating, his anger had been mostly vented. He comforted her. "It's nothing. Step aside. I'll apply medicine for my brother." Lady Lu reluctantly stepped aside and watched as Fan Xian applied the medicine to Fan Xizha's body. By this time, Fan Xizha was out of breath from the beating. He was on the verge of death and could faint at any moment. Fan Jian looked to the side. His daughter-in-law and daughter were standing obediently in the corner. Wonner's eyes were filled with fear. The beating that had just taken place must have been frightening. Ruorwo's eyes were filled with tears, not because of the pain her brother had suffered, but because of her brother's incompetence. He shook his head and coughed. Drawing everyone's attention, he asked Fan Xian evenly, "How are the arrangements?" "According to your wishes, Xizha will leave tonight," Fan Xian said respectfully. "It has already been arranged." Chapter 294. The conversation between the father and son continued, as if no one else was present. The three women who were listening were dumbfounded. Was it not enough to beat Fan Xizha to such a state? Was he going to be exiled from the capital? "Master, what did you say?" Lu Shi's eyes were wide with fear, and she looked at her master helplessly. Fan Xizha, who had been lying on the bench, had already leapt up from it. She did not know how he could still be so strong, given his injuries. It looked as if being exiled from the capital was a terrifying thing for all the nobles in the capital. Fan Xizha's butt was in the air, and he was hugging his mother's legs. He squeezed his eyes, and a few drops of tears rolled down his cheeks, competing with the pockmarks on his face. His mouth was wide open, but before he could say anything, He had been hit so hard that he lost his voice. He anxiously opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The young man's tears were bright, and he shook his head furiously, unable to speak. His back was covered in blood, and he looked very pitiful. Master, Lu sure couldn't take it anymore, and she looked at Fan Xian with resentment. She was like a tree that had been cut in half, and she knelt in front of Fan Xian. She cried and begged, "No, you can't. He is your precious son. Can you bear to see him be kicked out of the house? Can you bear to see him wander in a foreign country without any family?" She quickly grabbed Fan Ruoro's hand and said, "Ruoro, quick, ask your father for mercy. Don't kick Xija out of the house." Lu sure thought that using the incident at the Baoyu house to kick Fan Xija out of the house must have been Fan Xian talking behind their backs. Last night, the father and son had talked for a long time, so she quickly pulled Ruoro into the fray. She thought that although Ruoro was not her own daughter, they had lived together for over 10 years. She loved Fan Xija, and everyone knew that Fan Xian loved his sister the most. Fan Ruoro did not expect her brother to receive such a heavy punishment. She was pulled by Lu Shi, and she knelt down. Her voice trembled as she said, "Father, my brother has been taught a lesson. He will not do it again. Please forgive him this time." Wonder stood by the side alone. Her heart was slightly flustered, and she hurriedly knelt down. Fan Jian remained calm until his daughter-in-law, who had a special status, knelt down as well. Only then did he help her up. He frowned at Lady Lu and said, "Xija must go, and don't blame Fan Xian. This is what I want." Madame Lu looked at him in disbelief, wondering why he was doing this. However, she knew very well that Fan Jian was a man with a gentle and upright appearance, but in reality, he had the air of a great general and a murderous aura. Otherwise, she wouldn't have fallen in love with him at first sight and refused to marry him. Since this was his idea, he would definitely not change it. She was a shrewd woman. Biting her lip, she turned around and bowed to Fan Xian. Weakly she pleaded, "Young master, please say something to persuade the master." At this moment, the only person who could make Fan Jian withdraw his intention of exiling Fan Xija was Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not want to accept her bow, and he quickly avoided it. With a bitter smile, he looked at his father, asking for his opinion. Fan Jian coldly shook his head and said, "His crime today, if the imperial censor were to report it to the court, he would be exiled for 3,000 miles. I will kick him out of the capital, and that will be better than the court taking action." Madame Lu did not believe this. With Fan Xian's current power and influence, even if Fan Xian were to open a brothel and kill a few prostitutes, as long as it was not a crime of treason, Fan Jian and Fan Xian would be able to suppress it. She could not help but cry, "Master, how could you be so cruel? Xija, he is only 14. If I am not cruel, then this would happen." Fan Jian coldly laughed at himself. 14? Don't forget, when Fan Xian was 12 years old, he was already forced to kill, he yelled harshly. As soon as he said this, the entire room was silent. Lin Wan-er and Fan Ruoro, who did not know about this, looked at Fan Xian in shock. Madame Lu, who had always been tied down by this matter, was frightened and lowered her head in despair. Fan Xian laughed awkwardly. He knew that it was not convenient for him to say anything more. He carefully picked up Xija, who was covered in wounds, and retreated to a corner. He then ordered his wife and sister to carry his brother into the bedroom, so that he could rest. Fan Xian, come back later. Fan Jian looked at Madame Lu and walked out of the study. Only Madame Lu and Fan Xian were left in the study, and the atmosphere was a little awkward. After a while, Madame Lu opened her eyes and said, "Are you really going to kick him out of the capital?" Fan Xian sighed and walked closer to her. He lowered his voice and comforted her. "Do not worry. Father only wants Xija to leave the capital for a while. He wants to train outside." Before he could finish, Madame Lu suddenly asked, "How far will he go?" "Very far." Fan Xian looked at the absent-minded Madame Lu, and thought that such a shrewd woman was worried about her son. He was suddenly confused, and for a moment he envied Fan Xija. He missed someone. "How far?" Madame Lu asked in a shrill voice. Fan Xian did not care about her attitude at this time. He said calmly, "Father decided it last night. I wanted to persuade him to send Xia to Danzhou to hide, but he was worried that grandmother would not be able to do it. So he changed it to Northern Qi." Northern Qi. Madame Lu felt a little more at ease. Although Northern Qi was far away, it was not like the southern barbarians or the western barbarians that the court had exiled. It was much more prosperous and safe. Although Northern Qi and Qing did not get along, after the peace treaty, the two countries were currently in a honeymoon period, and their relationship was excellent. Fan Xian looked at Madame Lu's pleading eyes and knew what she was thinking. He comforted her, "Do not worry. I have many friends in Northern Qi. I will take good care of him." The moon peeked out from the other side of the autumn tree. Compared to the bright lights of Fan Manor, it was much dimmer. The sons and nephews of the Fan and Lu families, who had been beaten up in the garden, were taken away by carriages from Shangshu Alley and other places. When the relatives of the Fan family saw the wretched state of their sons, they felt pain in their hearts. Their gazes toward Fan Manor were filled with a bit of hatred, but because of the power of the Fan family, no one dared to curse. In the study, Fan Xian was standing next to his father, mixing fruit berries for him. That night, Madame Lu stayed by Fan Xi's bedside and did not leave his side. The fruit berries that Minister Fan drank every night had to be seasoned by Fan Xian himself. The 3 people I mentioned to father have already been sent to the capital government. The 3 people he mentioned were all people who had committed murder in the Baoyu brothel. He looked at his father and spoke with concern. "The capital government is under the second son's control. I don't think they expected us to send them to the capital government. But those 3 people have been involved in murder cases, which means they are important people who want to take down Fan Xia. I think they will be picked up by the second son's people tonight." Fan Jian laughed and said, "Don't hide it from me. I know you won't be so careless. I will take care of it." Fan Xian laughed as well. This time, he had finally used all of the power Chen Pingping had given him, and he had mobilized the assassins of the 6th Bureau. They committed a crime punishable by death, but I think there will be repercussions from within the family. I will need you to make an appearance. Fan Jian knew what he was worried about. In the capital, there had never been an official who would harm a member of their own family. He shook his head and said, "What is there to make an appearance for? We have sent them to the capital government. What does that have to do with us?" Fan Xian heard this and was impressed. After thinking for a while, he said, "Xia, we will leave tonight. I will let Yin Bingyan take care of this. There shouldn't be any traces left behind." Fan Jian nodded and said, "I have nothing to do with the people of Northern Qi. Back in the day, I killed too many of them. Are you sure you can handle this?" Fan Xian met his father's gaze and knew that he was worried about Fan Xia's safety. He nodded solemnly and said, "Wang Qinian is now in Shangjing and I have a good relationship with Haitang and the Emperor of Northern Qi. Xia should be fine in Shangjing." Fan Jian sighed, and the white frost on his mane was particularly eye-catching tonight. He said, "You used to tell me that Xia was talented, and that he didn't have to study to become an official. I listened to you, but I didn't think this child would be more radical than you, and I thought he started doing this at the age of 14. What was I doing when I was 14? I was still studying with the crown prince in King Cheng's manor, now the emperor. All I thought about was how to have fun." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, "Yi Guiping's 3rd son is really something. He became the owner of a brothel at the age of 8. If this gets out, it will be recorded in the annals of Qing history. His name will go down in history. As for Yi Guiping, I will talk to her." Fan Jian shook his head. Although Xia is talented, he is still too superficial. Going down the path of evil is not a long-term solution. This time, I will take this opportunity to let him go out and see the world. First, I will punish him, and second, I hope that he will be able to become a useful person." Fan Xian sighed and said, "I have my own problems. Don't blame yourself." Fan Jian waved his hand and had him sit down. "When it happened, you weren't in the capital, but I am curious. Why did you seem so at ease when I suggested sending Xia to Northern Qi? You should know that Northern Qi does not treat the people of Qing well." Fan Xian did not speak of the wordless agreement he had made with Haitang and the young emperor, but he did explain his thoughts. He smiled and said, Xinjiang has been using the Cui family to smuggle goods into northern Qi. Now that Shenzhong is dead, there have been some problems with their routes. I think that if Xija can be trained in the north in a few years, perhaps he will have the opportunity to take over the Cui family's business. After all, he likes it. Since he wants to do business, I want to arrange a bigger business for him to do. Fan Jian smiled and looked at his son with satisfaction. Fan Xian's thoughts could be considered meticulous. Compared to Fan Jian and Chen Pingping's generation, he was only a little less ruthless. When do you plan to move against the Cui family? Seeing his father so easily point out his plan, Fan Xian did not feel the slightest bit uneasy. He smiled and said, It will be after I take over the palace treasury, around March or April next year. Fan Jian nodded and suddenly said with a gloomy face, Don't give them any chance to retaliate. This was the first time Fan Xian had seen his father's honest and kind face reveal a ruthless side. His heart trembled, and he responded in a low voice. Fan Jian continued to speak in a cold voice. You have handled this matter well. Temporary tolerance can buy you time to react. After Xija leaves, do what you want to do. Don't ask for my opinion. But there is someone. Yuan Meng. Is that her name? Fan Jian suddenly said. She does things shrewdly, and her style is sinister. In a few days, when this matter has died down, you can get rid of her. That will be the end of those cases. Fan Xian was shocked. He did not know if his father had killed Yuan Meng to avenge Xija, or if it was for some other reason. Fan Jian's next words revealed this minister's deepest humanism and his long-hidden spirit of universal love. He said coldly, I grew up in Lujing River, and I have always cherished flowers. What I hate the most are those who destroy them. Furthermore, this Yuan Meng was a woman from a brothel, and yet she was willing to lay her hands on a weak woman of the same profession. I cannot allow such a person to exist in this world. Fan Xian suddenly understood. He remembered that King Jing often teased him, and remembered that his father used to be a brothel guest. Those stories of his love affairs were still being spread throughout the capital. Seeing the tragic deaths of the prostitutes in the case file had touched his sensitive spot. No wonder he could not tolerate Yuan Meng. He took the opportunity to say, Yuan Meng is Hongqing's. Do you think about Hongqing and his sister's marriage? Without waiting for him to finish, Fan Jian shook his head and said, Hongqing is a good child. Let's keep an eye on him for a few more days. After all, this is a marriage arranged by the emperor. We need to be careful. Fan Xian was disappointed, and he was angry that his father did not care about Ruoro's happiness. He wondered if Ruoro was not as good as the women in the brothel. Fan Xian made up his mind. Even without his father's help, he was going to continue. He left the study room and entered it again. The three people in the study room saw him enter, and they all stood up to greet him. Shi Chanli handed over a document with dried ink and said, This is the agreement for the transfer of 70% of the shares of the Baoyu house. Please take a look, and then the second master will sign it. Mutai continued, The capital government has been keeping an eye on us. According to the information sent back by our spies, the capital government is troubled by the murder suspects we sent to them. Later, a servant from the second prince's side went to the capital government's manor. We don't know what they discussed. Fan Xian nodded and said, It doesn't matter. We won't be doing anything for the next few days. Mutai frowned and said, What if they misjudge the situation and think we are going to fight to the death? What if they send the capital government to arrest the second master? Fan Xian looked at Yin Bingyan, who had been silent this entire time. He shook his head and said, With the boss of the 4th Bureau here, if Fan Xija goes north, who will be able to find him? Chapter 295. After everything had been arranged, Fan Xian went to the bedroom. Lu Shi was lying on the edge of the bed, and it looked as if she had fallen asleep. He quietly woke her up, and they whispered to each other for a while. Lu Shi's tear-stained face gradually revealed a look of determination. She nodded and accepted this arrangement. She didn't know what Fan Xian had promised her, or how he had convinced her. It was getting late, and the insects in the garden had long since stopped chirping. Ruoro was accompanying Lu Shi. Fan Xian walked over to the side of his sleepy little brother and looked at his face, which was still gritting his teeth in hatred. He looked at the pockmarks that were about to burst out, and he couldn't help but smile and shake his head. He took the ink from the desk and took out the document that Shi Chanli had prepared. He pressed Sija's fingers onto the document. Seeing the bright red fingerprints on the snow-white document, Fan Xian nodded with satisfaction. From now on, the 70% of the shares that Sija owned in the Baoyu house were now officially transferred to someone else's hands. He was no longer associated with the brothel, which was filled with blood and bones. Wanner knew that he was in a bad mood, and she made a face at him, but she didn't get any response. Deep in her heart, she couldn't help but feel a little useless. She smiled. Fan Xian also smiled and said, "This has nothing to do with you. Children need to go out and try their luck." He suddenly asked, "Has Miss Shin been brought back?" "She is in the West Pavilion," Wanner explained. "Mr. Yen has already gone there." "Good," Fan Xian calmly agreed. And then he sat down next to Sija's bed. He thought for a moment, and then stood up again. He called for the kitchen staff to make some food, and then he sat down in the side room and picked up a bowl of hot porridge. He blew on it and slowly drank it. He wanted to give Yen and Miss Shin some time to reminisce. More importantly, he wanted to give Lu Shi some time to be alone with her son. He didn't know how much time had passed, but Deng Ziyu was led by a servant. He nodded at Fan Xian. Fan Xian understood. He didn't want anyone else to help him. So he walked into the bedroom and personally carried Fan Sija to the back of the courtyard through the corner gate. He then climbed into the carriage. Fan Sija was still in a daze. Lady Lu bit her lip and stroked his cheek affectionately, but he did not wake up. Ruoro also stroked his thick ears with reluctance. Even Wanner's eyes flashed with a hint of sadness at the separation. Only Count Sinan Fan Jian continued to sleep peacefully, as if he did not care about his youngest son at all. He was about to leave for a foreign country, and did not know when he would return. "You guys go first," Fan Xian said to the icy-faced Yin Bingyan. "I'll have to trouble your father with this matter. Be careful when you leave the city." After nightfall, the gates of Jingdo were closed. Only the people of the Overwatch Council had the power to silently send a person out of the city. Yen Bingyan slowly raised his head, glanced at him, and asked, "You're not coming?" Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "We'll meet at Songlin Bao. I still have some things to do." From the corner of his eyes, he could clearly see that his brother had tears in the corners of his eyes. He had clearly woken up, but he did not know why he had pretended to be unconscious in front of Lady Lu. Fan Sija's lips twitched. He must have hated Fan Xian and his father. In the darkness, besides the Chinian unit, there were also swordsmen from the 6th Bureau on standby. Based on the strength of this group, unless the second prince mobilized the Yi family's forces in the capital, there was no way they could face them head-on. Fan Xian stood below the carriage with his head lowered for a moment, then waved his hand. The carriage slowly began to move, heading out of the capital. Behind them, the three women who stood by the back door of Fan Manor couldn't help but look sorrowful. Lady Lu's sorrow was even greater. The unmarked carriages traveled through the quiet, dark streets of the capital. Yen Bingyan had used some unknown method to leave the city without a hitch. They stepped onto the official road outside the city and traveled northwest for half an hour. Using the moonlight, they saw that there was a small mountain in front of them, and they arrived at Songlin Bao. The carriages stopped there, waiting for Fan Xian. Fan Sija, who was in the carriage, suddenly opened his eyes at this moment. His eyes were still filled with ruthlessness. "Aren't you afraid that I'll run away during this exile journey?" There were only him and Yen Bingyan in the carriage. Yen Bingyan coldly said, "You're a smart man. Of course you know what to do. Fan Xian has used so many methods for your sake. Of course, it's not just to ensure your safety." Fan Sija lowered his voice and cursed. "It's to protect his own reputation." Yen Bingyan mockingly replied, "If it was just to protect his own reputation, he could have sent you directly to the capital government. Who could say anything about it?" Fan Sija knew this was the case, but he refused to admit it. In a shrill voice he said, "That's because father would not allow such a thing to happen." The minister? Yen Bingyun's cold eyes had an additional trace of mockery. "The minister's thoughts are not something that young people like you and I can think about," Fan Xizha weakly said. "Brother Yen, where does my brother want me to go?" "Northern Qi," Yen Bingyun replied. "Ah." Fan Xizha's face showed a look of despair. He let out a long sigh, and then fell to the ground in a manner that did not match his age. He lay down, but when he touched the wound on his back, he couldn't help but let out a scream. Yen Bingyun looked at him amused. Fan Xian's medicine, although effective, it is very overbearing. You should continue to endure it. Back when he was in Shangjing, Northern Qi, he had been tormented by Fan Xian in the same way. "I know what I'm doing. It looks terrible, but I haven't broken any bones. Why are you acting pitiful?" Fan Xian spoke coldly, and with a cold face, he walked into the carriage. Fan Xizha looked at the expression on Yen Bingyun's face, and thought of the punishment he had received earlier. "What are you doing?" Yen Bingyun frowned and looked at him. "Time is of the essence." Fan Xian put down the person he was carrying on his back, and threw her next to Fan Xizha. Suddenly, the carriage was filled with a faint fragrance. Fan Xizha was shocked. Looking at the woman's soft face, he was shocked. He shouted at Fan Xian, "What did you do to her?" The woman that Fan Xian had captured was the Baoyue brothel's most popular prostitute, Yen Er. Fan Xian looked at Fan Xizha and laughed mockingly. "You pity her that much? It looks like you have inherited your father's good genes. When you opened the brothel, why didn't you show some mercy?" Fan Xizha and Yen Bingyun did not understand the word genes, but they were curious as to why Fan Xian had captured this woman. Of course, with Fan Xian's skills and the use of drugs, and the fact that the Baoyue brothel was in a state of panic, it would have been easy for him to kidnap a prostitute. "Is she your first woman?" Fan Xian looked into his brother's eyes and softly asked. Fan Xizha thought for a while and nodded. His eyes looked pitiful, and he begged his brother to let the woman go. Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. "You are indeed stronger than me. 14 years old, and you already had your bud." He then laughed out loud and said seriously, "I know your attitude toward this woman is different from others. I also found out that she still has some affection for you, although you are only old enough to be her younger brother." Fan Xian couldn't help but smile. The Baoyue brothel will not be peaceful in the future. If Yen Er were to remain there, I don't think you would feel at ease. I will not bring her back to the manor. Even if my father allowed it, Auntie Lu would have killed her. Fan Xian calmly said. "After thinking about it, your journey up north, although it was meant to be a trial, it was far too lonely. It would not be good for your temperament. So, I brought her with me to accompany you." Fan Xizha and Yen Bingyun's eyes opened wide. They were full of disbelief. He was being exiled from the capital, and he was bringing a popular prostitute with him? Was this an exile, or was this a vacation? "Brother, what are you trying to do?" Fan Xizha did not believe that, after all the trouble he had caused, he would still be able to enjoy the privileges that even the second young master of the Fan Manor could not enjoy. He spoke with a stutter, and he looked at Fan Xian's calm face in fear. He even forgot about the pain he was feeling. Yen Bingyun looked at Fan Xian, and felt very confused. He shook his head and patted Fan Xizha's shoulder, saying, "Your brother is a wonderful man." He got off the carriage, and left the carriage for the two brothers. After a short silence, Fan Xian quietly looked at Xizha and said, "Why didn't you say goodbye to your mother?" Without waiting for him to answer, he asked, "Do you know why I am so angry this time? Why did father and I decide to send you away?" Fan Xizha lowered his head, and thought for a moment. He then said, "Sending me away? I don't have to worry about the capital government handling the Baoyue brothel case. Even if I run away to avoid punishment, I don't have to worry about that. That way my family can go and fight with the second son." Correct. Fan Xian was pleased to find that his brother, under his influence, had begun to refer to the princes as the second son and the third son. "Secondly, it is my punishment." Fan Xizha suddenly raised his head and endured the pain in his buttocks. He cried and said, "But I don't want to go. Brother, the people of Northern Qi Kingdom are very fierce. What can I do there? Do what? Fan Xian very seriously replied. Do what you are best at, of course. Do business. Fan Xizha raised his head stupidly. He did not look like the owner of the Baoyue brothel at all. He asked, do business? Yes, Fan Xian said. Father asked me to make some arrangements. I thought about it, and I decided to leave you 1,000 liang of silver. When you arrive in Shangjing, I will send someone to pick you up. But I will not give you any extra help. If you can within 5 months, turn this 1,000 liang of silver into 10,000, then I will truly acknowledge your ability. And then, 10 times? Before his brother could finish, Fan Xizha could not help but shout. I am not a god. That is your problem, Fan Xian said. 1,000 liang of silver is too little. Fan Xizha was both embarrassed and angry. This business is embarrassing. What kind of *T logic is this? When we opened Dombo bookstore, how much money did we spend? Bah! If you have the ability, then go and sell Story of the Stone. I promise I can turn 1,000 into 10,000. You wish. That guy with the surname Chow has already been driven crazy by me. Where else can he go? After the two brothers yelled at each other, the atmosphere became a little more relaxed. Fan Xian looked at Fan Xizha's chubby face and sighed. It is very windy out there. Father told me not to take too much care of you. You must be careful. Fan Xizha silently nodded and suddenly said, Brother, you said I am a genius at business. Do not worry. Fan Xian then said, I hope you do not blame me for chasing you out of the capital. Fan Xizha shook his head and did not say anything. Fan Xian knew he must be feeling very uncomfortable, so he frowned and said, Actually, the 2 reasons you gave me to get you out of the capital were false. Fan Xizha raised his head and looked very confused. Fan Xian quietly said, Even if you stay in the capital, what is there to be afraid of? Don't tell me I can't even protect you. I can just hide somewhere and wait for this to die down. I don't think the second prince would dare do anything to me. Even if the capital government were to investigate the Baoyue brothel, would they dare to search the capital in front of the Fan family? As for the second reason, you said it was to punish you. That is only a small part of it. Fan Xian looked at the unconscious Baoyue brothel headliner and calmly said, On this journey north, perhaps you will suffer a bit. But compared to the things you have done, it is really nothing. If I send you back to Danzhou, according to grandmother's way of doing things, I'm afraid you will be even more miserable. Fan Xizha was a little scared and pulled back his head. He did not dare make a sound because of the injury on his back. In his heart he was thinking, Then why do you have to chase me north? Fan Xian slowly lowered his eyelids and said, I didn't think you would be so daring in doing things and so ruthless. If you remained in Jingdo, for the sake of father and me, other people would always have this, or that kind of honey to lure you into the deepest valley. Thus, I feel that it's better for you to experience some wind and rain outside. Perhaps it will be more beneficial for your growth. He suddenly looked at Fan Xizha coldly and said, In business, you must do whatever it takes. But there must be a certain degree of control. If you are too sharp and cruel, it is easy to get hurt. Besides, as a person, it is always good to be kind to others. You must always try to be on the bright side. In reality, Fan Xizha had never been very happy with the Baoyue brothel. After all, in his eyes, the Baoyue brothel was a symbol of his success. The dirty things that were hidden in it were not a big deal. He lay on the long carriage stool and said with a grunt, These words are full of righteousness. Those who don't understand would think that my good brother has nothing to do with the Overwatch Council, and is instead a wooden scholar of the Imperial College. His words were full of mockery, but Fan Xian only raised his eyebrows. He was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and his subordinates specialized in doing dark things. A mere brothel, regardless of whether it was in terms of the density of darkness and filth, or in terms of the level of cruelty, was a world of difference. It was no wonder that his brother did not think much of his discipline. Fan Xian smiled and said, Do you think that I have always stood on the wrong side? And to use these words to talk about you is absurd? Fan Xizha saw his brother smile warmly, and began to panic again. He did not dare say anything, but his black eyes rolled. It was clear that this was what he meant. Of course I am not a saint. I am not even a good person, Fan Xian said. Fan Xian said, but even if it was a murderous butcher, if he truly cherished his family, presumably he would have the same thoughts as me. In our line of work, even if we reek of blood, we still want our brothers to be pure and clean. Perhaps it is because we have come into contact with the most evil things in the world. So we hope you can stay away from these things. Fan Xian heard him say, we, over and over again, and he was suspicious. Fan Xian thought for a moment, and then quietly told the story of Xiao En and Zhuang Mohan. He smiled and said, Xiao En has killed many people in his life, and done many evil things, but he still wanted to raise his brother to be a good man. In reality he succeeded. Zhuang Mohan did not disappoint him. Until the night before his death, I still admire him. Although your brother is not very talented, I want to do what Xiao En did. He seemed to be trying to convince his brother, but it also seemed like he was trying to comfort himself. It is good to be a good person. I want to be a good person too. This was the first time Fan Xian had heard of such a shocking secret. His mouth was wide open, and he was speechless for a long time. After a long time he said in a trembling voice, but, when I look at Master Zhuang's historical collections, I get a headache. Brother, if you want me to be a master, it will be too difficult. Fan Xian laughed angrily. With a brain like yours, of course you won't be able to study. Fan Xian didn't know what to say. Then tell me this story. Do your business well. In the future, you will strive to be a merchant whose name will go down in history. Fan Xian smiled encouragingly. Merchants don't have to be as treacherous as people think. In this world, there are some merchants who walk the bright path and still succeed. Fan Xian said foolishly, merchants focus on profit. You just need to make money. How can you go down in history? The bright path? Even if you succeed, you will still be a piece of fat meat in the mouths of the government. With me and my father, you can do business properly. Who would dare to do anything to you? Fan Xian looked at him with calm and gentle eyes. And have you forgotten about the Yi family? You told me on the Tsang Mountains that the reason you were interested in business, since you were young, was because when you were little, your father often told you about the Yi family's power and influence. If the mistress of the Yi family hadn't died, not to mention the government, even the big countries in the world wouldn't have dared to do anything to the Yi family. Fan Xian's eyes lit up, but they immediately dimmed. The brothel business is very profitable. It's more profitable than anything else. He still felt that in business, what was the point of saving face? Making money was the most important thing. Fan Xian smiled. I asked Big Yi of Qingyu Hall. He said that in the past, the Yi family did all kinds of business, except for these unorthodox ones. First of all, the mistress of the Yi family's gender determined it. She must have hated this business. Second of all, Big Yi's explanation is that unorthodox. Since there's the word unorthodox, then even if you can make a lot of money, in the end, it's not the right way. It's like the green water beside a big river. Although it's deep and endless, it can't be vast and mighty. If you really want to be the best in business, just playing around in these small rivers won't do. For some reason, the more Fan Xian spoke, the more excited he became. Perhaps it had touched the softest part of his heart. He said in a clear voice, it's not easy to live. Whatever you do, you have to do it to the extreme. Then you can't be satisfied with being an unscrupulous merchant. And you can't be satisfied with being an official merchant, or even a royal merchant. The way of business still exists. You have to be a merchant of the world. Not only will you be rich enough to rival a country, but you will also be respected by the people, and your name will be remembered for generations to come. Fan Xian spoke slowly, but Fan Xian felt a headache coming on. He looked at his brother helplessly and said, the Yi family back in the day even sold firearms. They helped the Qing kingdom destroy Northern Wei. The people in the north didn't like them very much. If we're talking about business by a brothel, I only used a few dirty tricks. Master Yuan only killed a few prostitutes, but the mistress of the Yi family has killed many innocent souls. Big brother, what you're saying? Fan Xian was at a loss for words. He waved his hand disinterestedly, stopping Fan Xija from continuing to compare. He said, "In any case, bullying the weak is not very interesting." Fan Xija suddenly looked worried and said, "Big brother, I really don't want to leave the capital." He then said, "Father and mother are in the capital, and I want you to be filial to them on my behalf." He knew that only if he left the capital would the Bauua brothel incident truly die down. The weapon the second prince used to draw the Fan family to his side would disappear without a trace. Although Fan Xian would never admit this, seeing his father's decision, he knew that he had brought trouble to his family. And after hearing what Fan Xian had said, the 14-year-old boy felt a surge of desire. If he could reach the level of the mistress of the Yi family in this lifetime, how great would that be? Fan Xian nodded and agreed. He leaned over to his brother and whispered something into his ear. Finally, he told him about the people he could trust in Shangjing. Fan Xija suddenly heard his brother's true intentions, and for a moment he was stunned. The palace treasury, smuggling to the north, the Cui family, such a large amount of money. Did he have the ability to do so? Chapter 296. Do you still remember last year when I beat up Guobaoquan with an underground fist? The capital government wanted to hold me accountable? I remember. Do you still remember this year's spring examination case? And the Ministry of Justice wanted to interrogate me. I remember. Fan Xija glanced at him with some confusion. Was his brother saying this to remind him of the dignity of Qing law? But the problem was that these two cases ended without a conclusion. It only proved that in a place like the kingdom of Qing, power was still above the law. It was clearly a negative example. Fan Xian smiled and patted his butt. Both times you beat the officials with sticks in your hands. Although it was mainly because of your arrogant and domineering personality, you always have a sense of friendship toward me, a brother you've known for less than 2 years. I believe I'm not wrong about this. Fan Xija's buttocks were full of scars. He bit his lower lip in pain and said, "Then why did you hit me so hard earlier?" Fan Xian smiled. "First of all, I'm really angry. I won't hide it from you. Second, if I don't beat you up badly, how can I make the people of Jingdo believe that the Fan family is still strict and strict? It's half acting and half real." Fan Xija suddenly said in a daze, "Brother, such an important matter in the north. Are you really leaving it to me?" Fan Xian replied, "Prove yourself first." Fan Xija gritted his teeth and revealed a fanatical expression. He said with hatred, "Fine, I can definitely do it." Fan Xian nodded and looked at the sleeping prostitute of the Bauua brothel by his brother's side. He raised his eyebrows and said, "Yesterday, when we raided the building, I discovered that this woman has some affection for you. I am your brother, so of course, I know that your heart is very hard and ruthless. But when it is time to be soft, you can be soft. Perhaps you will find that life will be much more interesting." After all, Fan Xija was still young, and it was his first time experiencing the affairs between a man and a woman. His face flushed with embarrassment as he responded. The two brothers continued to talk in the carriage. At this moment the carriage came to a halt. The two of them knew that it was time to part ways. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "This trip will be difficult and dangerous. Although you must still feel resentment toward me, I think in the future you will understand my good intentions. As for father, don't feel any resentment. You have to know that in this world, other than parents and brothers, it is difficult for anyone to truly treat you well. You were chased out of Jingdo at such a young age. Naturally, Aunt Lu is sad. I'm afraid father won't have it easy either." Fan Xija nodded sadly. Watching Fan Xian's silhouette disembark from the carriage, he thought of the days to come. He couldn't help but feel empty in his heart. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he felt unspeakably uncomfortable. "Brother, bring me back soon." Fan Xian's figure stiffened as he got off the carriage. "Don't worry, I'll settle everything quickly." Watching the carriage slowly disappear into the night, Fan Xian could not help but feel a little absent-minded. He was not a good person. So why did he demand that Xija be a good person? Perhaps his previous explanation was correct. The relationship between people was very delicate. Wang Jingwei did not want his son to be a traitor, and Hitler probably would have preferred his son to be a painter. Of course, these two did not have the opportunity to show Fan Xian, but he had seen the relationship between Xiao En and Zhuang Mohan, the two brothers, over the decades, and he deeply agreed with them. The legendary pair of brothers, Xiao En, had secretly done many things for Zhuang Mohan. No one knew, but he had always hidden himself in the dark. He cared about his brother's reputation and refused to acknowledge him. This was already a remarkable thing. When Zhuang Mohan was in his 70s or 80s, he was almost at the end of his rope. His personal reputation had reached the peak of his life. In order for his brother to escape, he did not hesitate to abandon his lifelong beliefs and come all the way to Qing Kingdom to frame Fan Xian. The price he paid was not as simple as it seemed. He completely abandoned what Zhuang Mohan treasured the most. Coincidentally, before these two influential figures passed away, Fan Xian was by their side. Fan Xian watched the carriage leave and sighed in his heart. He did not know whether or not Xija would bear a grudge against him. He also did not know, in the distant future, if he were to one day sink into the darkness like Xiaoen, would Xija be like Zhuang Mohan and risk everything to save him? The night wind blew over the hills outside the capital. Fan Xian shook his head in self-mockery. Given Xija's personality, he would at most be willing to lose tens of thousands of taels of silver for him. If the amount of silver was a little more, that greedy and cruel little guy would have to reevaluate. Yan Bingyan stood beside him and suddenly said, "You are a very hypocritical person." Fan Xian asked with great interest, "Why do you say that? You use everyone around you, but you make it seem like you are doing it for their own good." The corners of Yan Bingyan's lips curled up slightly. Fan Xian replied calmly, "You don't have a brother, so you can't understand this kind of feeling. I really am doing it for his own good. Although my methods may have been a bit excessive, and the results may not have been good, but there is no other way. My experience can only go so far. At least in the future, I can say to myself that I have done my part as a brother for Xija's growth. That is the second point I wanted to make." Yan Bingyan nodded. "You are a very cruel person." Fan Xian was silent, knowing that Yan Bingyan would continue. Young Master Fan is still young, and the situation in the north is very complicated. And yet you were able to ruthlessly expel him from the capital and make him disappear, cutting off the possibility of others blackmailing you. It seems that even the second prince did not expect such a ruthless move, Yan Bingyan said coldly. There was no smile on Fan Xian's face. Instead he asked, "How do you think people should live their lives?" After Ruoro, Xija, and Wan. This was the fourth time Fan Xian had asked someone about Ostrovsky's eternal question. Yan Bingyan was slightly startled and shook his head. "My thinking is very simple. As an official of the Overwatch Council, I should be loyal to His Majesty, to the Kingdom of Qing, to make the country rich and powerful, and to unify the world." "Unify the world?" Fan Xian said sarcastically. "What is the point of that?" Yan Bingyan was startled again. As a member of the younger generation of the Kingdom of Qing, he had grown up in a time when the country's power was expanding rapidly. This kind of thinking was ingrained in his bones. He had never thought about why he wanted to unify the world, and no one had ever asked him about it. Now that Fan Xian had suddenly asked him this question, he did not know how to explain it. The world is divided into 3 parts, and there are many small countries in the middle. War is inevitable, and the people are destitute. In that case, why not unify the world and get rid of the threat of war? After thinking for a while, he tried to sort out his thoughts. Fan Xian shook his head. "I have never believed in the power of the world. Divided for a long time, united for a long time, divided for a long time. United for a few hundred years, divided for another few hundred years. If the divided countries did not have the ambition to unify the world, then where would there be war? Unifying the world is not a way to get rid of war and bring peace. It is a fruit to tempt the people of the world to throw themselves into war. If everyone did not think this way, then wouldn't the world be at peace?" Yan Bingyan glanced at him and mockingly said, "That is a very childish way of thinking." "I also understand," Fan Xian sighed. "But when I am alive, I really do not want to see such things as war. In 1 year, The number of people who died at the hands of the council is about 400. In August, the Yangtze River broke its banks. I estimate tens of thousands of people have already died. If war truly starts, in just a few months, I'm afraid hundreds of thousands of people will die. Even if the conflict can be temporarily suppressed, it cannot last. There will come a day when war breaks out. Yan Bingyan snorted disdainfully. Even if you gather the 4 great grandmasters as fighters and forcefully suppress the ambitions of the royal family, what will happen after you die? Fan Xian smiled and said, After I die? After I die, even if the flood reaches the sky. Louis Xiv's most blatant declaration finally made Yan Bingyan's expression change. He shook his head and sighed. I thought you were a benevolent person hiding in the darkness. After hearing what you said, only then do I realize that what I said just now was considered polite. Not only are you ruthless, but you are also an extremely selfish person. You misunderstood, didn't you? I told you last time, I am not a saint. Fan Xian suddenly frowned and teased him. But now it looks like, it seems there is no harm in being a saint. A saint in charge of the Overwatch Council? Yan Bingyan looked at him, like he was looking at a ghost. Then how do you plan to spend the rest of your life? Yan Bingyan rarely asked a question like those people in Shangjing in northern Qi. I plan to spend the rest of my life well. Fan Xian said this superfluous sentence. Without waiting for a response, he laughed and said, This time, Xia has gone north, and I have troubled you and your father. To send a person through the entire Qing kingdom, without anyone knowing, other than monitoring the movements of the officials in each county, and the Overwatch Council, which controlled the foreign spy network, going easy everywhere, or even stealing from within, it was truly impossible to do this. You are my superior, Yan Bingyan replied directly. Fan Xian understood what he was thinking and said, I will report this to the director. He continued, Did you know? The last time the diplomatic mission left the capital, the first night they set up camp in this pine forest below us. He rubbed his nose and laughed at himself. At that time, Sea Lily was in the diplomatic mission. Today, Xia has been exiled. Although his situation is much worse than mine, I also captured a woman to accompany him. It seems that our journey will not be lonely. Yan Bingyan shook his head with a slight headache. It was difficult for him to get used to Fan Xian's shamelessness, which he only showed to his close subordinates and friends. So he asked, Now that there is nothing to worry about, what do you plan to do? Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He is a prince. Do you really think we would dare to kill him? Yan Bingyan coldly said, I don't think there is anything you wouldn't dare to do. Fan Xian's heart jumped, and he smiled and said, It looks like you really do understand me. But there is no rush. First, I will ruin Hongqing's reputation. Then, I will torture the second prince's men and force the Cui family into a corner. In the end, he quietly said, I will no longer concern myself with the Baoyue brothel. You help Shi Chanli deal with it. As for what to do next, you are in charge. After all, when it comes to scheming, you are far more talented than I am. Chapter 297. The Baoyue brothel was still open for business. Although there were a few well-informed people who knew that the Fan family and the second prince had been fighting over the most popular brothel in the capital. The Fan family had only beaten the Baoyue brothel a little, and did not have much of a reaction. The Overwatch Council did not make things difficult for the Baoyue brothel either, so everyone thought the matter was over. In the minds of these officials, this was a very natural outcome. After all, no matter how arrogant Fan Xian was, there was always a lot of taboo in front of a prince. Furthermore, in the eyes of the public, the second master of the Fan family was running the Baoyue brothel. Although it had damaged the reputation of the Fan family, he had earned a lot of money from it. If everyone worked together to suppress this matter, it would be a win-win situation. To the people of the capital who did not know what was going on, they only saw the Overwatch Council raiding the brothel, and heard the beating of the wooden planks in Fan Manor. To them, there was something strange about the whole thing. When did the Emperor's Secret Service begin to manage the brothel? What had happened to the Fan family? Why had the little tyrants of the streets of the capital suddenly disappeared without a trace? But regardless of whether they knew about this matter or not, they all thought that this matter would be the same as the usual conflicts between influential officials in the capital. In the end, because of the invisible but dense network of relationships in the air, it would disappear without a trace. As the saying goes, good for you, good for me, and good for everyone. However, the managers, girls, and shopkeepers of the Bayou brothel were not as relaxed as outsiders thought. This was because ever since the Overwatch Council raided the brothel, the big boss had not returned to the Bayou brothel. It was as if he had disappeared. Although there were rumors that the young big boss was under house arrest, no one could rest easy without confirmation. Plus, the second boss had a special status, so he could not watch over the brothel every day. For a while, the Bayou brothel maintained a calm appearance, but there was an undercurrent that was slowly flowing under the surface. On the other side of the undercurrent, the people of the second prince were also wondering why the Fan family had sent the people involved in the murder of the brothel to the capital government. Ever since Mei Jili had changed positions, this important yamen had always been under the control of the second prince. The other party must have known that the capital government was within the scope of the second prince's power. If the Fan family was prepared to shed all pretense of cordiality and send the second young master to the authorities for investigation, then why was it that there was only news of the second young master being grounded? There was no sign of the Overwatch Council or the Fan family making a move. The second prince was having a headache over this matter. He had no idea that the Fan family would so decisively expel Fan Xija from the capital and quietly send him to a foreign country. The Overwatch Council's work was flawless, but there was still a faint worry that prompted the second prince to begin making preparations. But now that things had come to a head, they realized that they had nothing to do with the Bayou house. They were innocent. Even if they were to guard against Fan Xian's revenge, they did not know what Fan Xian could possibly do to them. So how could they guard against him? No one could grasp Fan Xian's thoughts. No one could guess Sir Yin Jr.'s ability to execute. On this day, the wind was gentle and the clouds were light. The yellow leaves were falling, and it was a perfect day for a trip outside the capital. There were still 6 days until the day of the royal family's chrysanthemum viewing. The officials and commoners of the capital had all brought their families to the outskirts of the capital. Since it was still daytime, the Bayou house was particularly quiet. Because the future was uncertain, and the owner was missing, the usually energetic receptionists were leaning against a pillar. The girls by the lake were forcing themselves to smile, and they were accompanying the old perverts who liked to indulge in daylight. Some unknown insects were hopping around the stone steps of the side corridor, crying out with all their might. They struggled to no avail, waiting for their end to come. The waiters in the building all looked a little uneasy. They picked up the rag and wiped the table. In the past, Fan Xija had given strict orders that the table had to be tested with a white silk. They had to confirm that there was not a speck of dust on it before it passed. How could it be as easy as it was now? Suddenly someone walked in. This person's eyebrows were very thick, and they looked as if they had been painted on. Although this appearance was not out of the ordinary, it was very easy to remember. So, one of the receptionists who had received him one night immediately recognized him. He froze next to the door of the Bayou house. His body sprung up, but he did not dare go forward to greet him. It was one of the waiters who looked at the receptionist strangely. He neatly put the gray rag in his hand on the table and sang, "A guest has arrived." The end of his voice was crisp and very pleasant to listen to. The person who came was slightly startled, and a wry smile appeared on his face. It seemed that there was a great deal of difficulty in his heart. He stood in the incomparably wide hall of the Bayou house for a while. Finally he could not help but shake his head and say, "Tell Si Qing, to come see me." This time, it was the waiter's turn to be shocked. He thought to himself that this guest was very arrogant. He wanted Si Qing, to come see him personally, and he even called her by her name. There were many nobles in the capital, but of those who came to the Bayou house, who did not treat Si Qing with respect. The receptionist, who knew this person, finally came to his senses. He wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead and ran in front of the person. He respectfully said, "Sir, I will go and inform you immediately." He then asked the waiters to lead the person to the second floor of the third floor. It was the quietest room in the Baoyu house, and he ordered the waiters to take good care of him. When the person went upstairs, the waiters on the first floor surrounded him. They did not stop talking, and they did not know which deity had come. The Baoyu house was currently in a state of turmoil, but the people's hearts were already wavering. The slightest movement would cause everyone to feel uneasy. Finally, someone remembered that this person with thick eyebrows, who looked like an ordinary scholar, was actually the companion of young Master Chun, who came to visit the prostitute that day. Who was Mr. Chun? It was the brother of the owner of the Baoyu house. It was Mr. Fan, the most popular person in the government. The person who had come was Mr. Fan's confidant, and it was likely that he was a high-ranking official in the Overwatch Council. Everyone in the brothel was stunned. They all knew what had happened that day. The brothel had offended Mr. Fan, and even the owner had suffered. Today someone else had come. Was it possible that the Overwatch Council was going to raid the brothel again? Could the Baoyu house continue to operate? At this time, someone sighed and said, "I think the brothel will have to pay a large sum of money to settle this. It is a shame. Although the owner is a bit cruel, he is very good at business. For no reason at all, he has to feed the mouths of these officials. No matter how good the business is, it will be ruined." Bah! Someone could not bear to see him pretend to be the great priest of the Qing temple. He laughed and said, "You idiot! The owner of the Baoyu house is Mr. Fan's brother. If the Overwatch Council wanted to collect money, it would not come to us. Do you think the two of them are going to collect money from each other? There's even an old minister overseeing them." The man's face was cut, and he mumbled, "Then what is this person doing here with Commissioner Fan?" It was Shi Changli. Fan Xian was having a good time, and Shi Changli was a scholar. He had been chased to a brothel by his teacher, so it was only natural that he was in a bad mood. Si Qinger's eyes flashed, and she respectfully offered him tea. She knew that although the man in front of her was not an official, he was a trusted aide of Commissioner Fan. The owner had been missing for the past few days, and now that he had suddenly appeared, she had no idea what he was here for. She paused and then gently asked, "Mr. Shi, what brings you here today?" Shi Changli hesitated for a moment. Si Qinger was someone that the third prince had picked out. She didn't have much of a relationship with the Fan family, so when she saw him hesitate, she misunderstood his intentions. She covered her lips and smiled. "We are all family now. Does Mr. Shi still want to raid our building?" When she said the word raid, her tongue curled. It was a strange sound. Shi Changli's eyebrows furrowed, and he did not like this woman's flippancy. His face darkened, and he pulled out a document. In a low voice he said, "Today, I am not here to raid the brothel. I am here to take over." "Take over?" Si Qinger froze. She picked up the thin document from the table and quickly scanned it. Her face changed, and when she saw the red fingerprints at the bottom, she bit her lip. After a moment of silence, she finally digested the shock in her heart. She opened her eyes wide and asked, "The owner has given you all of the brothel's shares?" Her voice was filled with shock and disbelief. 70% of the Baoyu brothel's shares were worth a lot of money. How could it be so easily transferred? Si Qinger knew that this matter was not as simple as it seemed. She frowned and said, "Mr. Shi, this is too big a deal. I cannot accept it." Shi Changli gave a wry smile and said, "I do not need you to accept it. From today onwards, I am the owner of the Baoyu brothel. I am only here to inform you." Si Qinger gritted her teeth and said, "Mr. Shi, if I may ask, where is the owner? This is such a big deal, and I have to talk to him face to face." Shi Changli was good at writing, and the document he had drafted a few nights ago was clean and simple. He did not expect that in the end, he would be forced by Fan Xian to become the owner of the brothel. He was already uncomfortable with the situation, and he felt as if he had been caught in a trap of his own making. Hearing the question being asked, he coldly said, "Is this transfer document fake? Don't waste my time. The people who will be checking the accounts will be here soon. Don't even think about it. Si Qinger sensed that the Fan family was preparing to leave the Baoyu brothel and used the scholar in front of her as a cover. But her rank was not high enough, and she did not know much about what was going on. Master Yuan had suddenly disappeared, and so she said, "Since the Baoyu brothel is going to be owned by Shi Chanli, I am just trying to make a living. How could I dare to argue with you?" Her heart had calmed down, and she smiled and said, "But this brothel still has 30% of its shares in the hands of that young man. I am sure you know this, Mr. Shi." No matter what was said, as long as the third prince's shares were in the Baoyu brothel, the Fan family would not be able to get rid of the Baoyu brothel. She did not know that Fan Xian had no intention of getting rid of the Baoyu brothel in the first place. Shi Chanli looked at her and suddenly laughed. His thick eyebrows twitched, and he said, "Today, I am closing the brothel because I would like to trouble you, Miss Qing. Please tell the second owner that I will be taking the 30% shares." "I will be taking them? How arrogant of you," Si Qinger said angrily. She thought it was easy for the Fan family to give and take, but she did not expect them to take the third prince's shares. How could it be so easy? Shi Chanli had finally gotten into the role of the brothel owner, and he calmly said, "If you want to take the 30% shares, I have many ways of doing so. Bringing it up now is to give face to the second owner. Miss Qinger, you must understand this." Si Qinger coldly said, "Oh, it looks like I have to thank you, Mr. Shi. But I do not know. How much money are you willing to pay?" Shi Chanli extended a finger. 100,000? Si Qinger asked, confused. She thought this was a fair price. Even if the Baoyu brothel continued to operate well, 100,000 for 20% of the shares was a good price to pay. Shi Chanli shook his head. "Only 10,000? Si Qinger was shocked. "I only have 1,000 liang of silver," Shi Chanli said sincerely. "Scholars are always poor." "You are too much," Si Qinger angrily shouted. "Do not think that the Fan family can hide the truth. Do not forget who these 30% shares belong to." Shi Chanli raised an eyebrow and calmly said, "Miss, do not misunderstand. These 70% shares belong to me, Shi Chanli. It has nothing to do with the Fan family or the Kai family. As for who the 30% shares belong to, I do not care." Si Qinger coldly said, "What if I do not give up the 30% shares? First of all, the Baoyu brothel may be found with a copy of some of their letters, such as colluding with a foreign country. As for what the charges are, I am not sure." Shi Chanli smiled and said, "Second, the Baoyu brothel will soon appear in the capital. Since I own 70% of the shares, I can chase away all of the workers, customers, and girls. Then, the Baoyu brothel will hire them again. Miss Qinger, think about it. The Baoyu brothel, which has not yet existed, can take down the Baoyu brothel in a short period of time?" Si Qinger looked determined, and she refused to back down. She said, "I do not believe the first point. Would the Fan family, no, Mr. Shi, be willing to see the Baoyu brothel collapse? Would they use 70% of the shares to take us down with them?" She looked proud and said, "The second point is even more impossible. When the owner chose the location, he was very particular about it. Plus, these girls have signed a death contract with us. How could they just leave?" Shi Chanli shook his head and sighed. "Miss Qinger, it looks like you still do not understand the situation. You have to understand that I am the owner of the Baoyu brothel. What death contract or living contract?" Si Qinger's face changed. Shi Chanli stood up and pushed open the window. He smiled and said, "As for the location of the Baoyu brothel, I will not hide it from you. It is to the side of the Baoyu brothel, and it is also near Thin Lake. The reason why I came back after a few days was because 2 days ago, I was busy collecting the title deed for the land." Si Qinger was speechless. Shi Chanli was now completely immersed in his role as a ruthless businessman. He waved his hand to catch the wind from Thin Lake and continued to say, "As for taking me down with you, if you do not want to back out, then I will take you down with me. 70% of the Baoyu brothel's shares may be worth a lot of money, but I do not care for it." After he said this, he laughed at himself. When did he begin to wash away his status as a scholar? Instead, he began to indulge in a life of bullying others? He was indeed threatening Si Qinger, but this kind of threat was easy to make. It seemed simple, but it was difficult for her, or rather the third prince, to respond. The land next to the Baoyu brothel had indeed been purchased by the Overwatch Council, but no one knew what methods had been used. Shi Chanli knew that every step of taking over the brothel had been done in a very stable manner. There was no need to worry about any mistakes. Mr. Yin Bingyan was very powerful. If the third prince did not want to give up the 30% of the shares, Mr. Yin Bingyan had a way to make the Baoyu brothel close down within 10 days. Lady, you do not know the root of this matter. Do not think too much about it. Shi Chanli did not need her to send a message to the third prince. The news that Fan Xian wanted to take over the Baoyu brothel had already been passed through the Fan manor and into the ears of Yi Guipin, who was in the palace. Now, the third prince was forced to copy books by Yi Guipin every day. Even if he felt bad that his money had been stolen by his cousin, he could not find a way to stop this. He looked at Si Qinger's confused face, and the gentle nature of a scholar came into play. He smiled and said, I am a very easy person to talk to. In the future, if you continue to work in the brothel and do your best, I will not mistreat you. Who knew that Si Qinger was such a stubborn person? She always wanted to be responsible for the second owner. Although the second owner was only a young child, she thought of the child's identity and thought the whole thing was ridiculous. In the capital, it was common for people to steal property, but how could someone dare to steal property from a prince? If the second owner sends a message, I will agree. She gritted her teeth and said, but the money in the account, you and I have to make sure to settle it properly. It cannot be messed up. Shi Chanli nodded. The group of people who had been waiting outside the brothel finally entered. Seeing the group of people, Si Qinger's eyes widened. They were all Overwatch Council secret agents in casual clothing. They were still secret agents. With such a group of people coming to take over the brothel, who would dare to stop them? When she saw the old man with the long beard in the middle of the group, who was praising the Baoyu brothel, Si Qinger could not help but take a deep breath. She was speechless, thinking that no matter how hard she tried, she would not be able to stop Fan Xian from taking the third prince's money. With the third Yi shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall personally taking over, no matter how the accounts were calculated, she was afraid that the Baoyu brothel would end up being owned by the Shi family. No, the goddamn Fan family. He would not choke, and perhaps he would not even bother to drink a bowl of water. Chapter 298. The shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall had always felt the pulse of the palace treasury and managed the businesses of the various kings. It had been many years since they had made an appearance. But Si Qinger was a girl who had worked her way up from being a prostitute to being a top-notch madam. She was someone who was willing to learn, had a desire to improve, and had a deep understanding of the ways of business. She knew the old men of Qingyu Hall well. As long as they were in business, they all had a deep respect for the elders of the Yi family. It was the same as how the scholars of the world looked at Zhuang Mohan. So when Si Qinger saw the three-leaf shopkeeper arrive, she immediately gave up all thoughts of playing tricks on the accounts. She was even more prepared to lose everything. She gracefully stepped forward and respectfully bowed. The three-leaf shopkeeper was probably in his 50s, and the beard on his chin was dyed white. He looked at Si Qinger's beautiful face and nodded his head in appreciation. Shi Chanli was frozen to the side, wondering why Master Xian had sent such an old pervert. The three-leaf sighed and said, "This lady, you must be the owner of this building. I look at the location of the building, the lighting and the decorations. They are all the work of a genius. I am truly impressed. If you are willing to continue to stay in the building, I will return to Commissioner Fan. There is no need for my old bones to meddle." Si Qinger looked embarrassed and said, "You are too kind. Everything in this building is the work of the owner. It has nothing to do with me." The third Yi shopkeeper had a look of pity on his face. He sighed and said, "This big boss is indeed a genius in business. How could he offend Fan?" Fortunately, he was old and not stupid. He knew his words were going too far. So he quickly shut his mouth under the gaze of Shi Chanli, who looked at him like he was an old monster. He only shook his head vigorously and looked around. His expression was full of the sigh of someone who was at the peak of Dong Mountain, but did not see any aces. In the eyes of the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, who had been involved in the business for 20 years, although the Baoyu brothel was a shady business, the building was very bright. There was a lake behind the building, and there was a courtyard by the lake. The waiters knew when to stop, and they knew how to be polite. The girls were not arrogant, and they did not lose their composure. It was a perfect fit for the hearts of the customers. The man who was in charge of all of this was a man who had a deep understanding of business. The old shopkeeper sighed. Sir Chanli couldn't help but shake his head, thinking that the second young master of the Fan family was not a simple son of a noble family. It was a wonderful thing, though. The two brothers of the Fan family were different from the rest of the world. There had been no news from the palace, so Si Qing'er did not dare make a decision about the third prince's money. But now that the collection team had arrived, they had to bring out the account books for both parties to check. Although most businesses in the Qing kingdom had open accounts and secret accounts, in front of the three-leaf shopkeeper, Si Qing'er did not dare play any tricks. In the time it takes to burn a stick of incense, the Baoyu brothel's money had been clearly accounted for. The 30% of the shares, which had been converted into 1,000 liang of silver, had been temporarily separated. All that was left was to wait for the news from the third prince. After that, the entire Baoyu brothel would become Sir Chanli's business. After finishing all of this, Si Qing'er thought that the next owner of the Baoyu brothel would be the three-leaf shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall. She did not expect the old shopkeeper to leave in a carriage, which surprised Si Qing'er. What surprised her even more was that the new owner of the Baoyu brothel was someone she knew, Sang Wen. Si Qing'er was stunned, but she quickly came to her senses. After Fan Xian had forcefully bought Sang Wen away, there had been no news of her. Now she was back. Sir Chanli looked at her expression and said, "Not bad. This lady Sang will be the owner of the Baoyu brothel from now on." Si Qing'er forced herself to bow to Sang Wen. Back when they were in the brothel, Sang Wen was always cold and unyielding because of her reputation. It was inevitable that Si Qing'er would make things difficult for her. Now that she had become the owner of the Baoyu brothel, she knew she would not have a good time. She suppressed the anger in her chest and prepared to return to her room to pack up her belongings. Sang Wen was a little uneasy. Mr. Fan had treated her well, and since he had given her the responsibility of managing the Baoyu brothel, she had to take care of it properly. But she was also a little afraid of the third prince's power. Seeing that Si Qing'er was willing to back down, she felt relieved. Sir Chanli furrowed his eyebrows and said, "Lady Qing'er, you cannot leave." Si Qing'er coldly laughed and said, "I did not sign a contract with the Baoyu brothel. Why can't I leave?" Sir Chanli felt a headache coming on and loosened the buttons on his collar. After thinking for a while, he said, "I have never run a brothel before. Lady Sang is only a singer. If you leave, I do not know if the Baoyu brothel will be able to make money." Si Qing'er now knew that he still needed her. She couldn't help but feel proud of herself. She smiled and said, "If..." Before she could finish her sentence, Sir Chanli cut her off and said, "Mr. Fan has said that if he does not say anything, you are not allowed to leave the Baoyu brothel." Si Qing'er was angry. She finally understood that it was not that he needed her, but rather that he wanted her dead. She was just a woman. Even if she had some connection to the third prince, if the commissioner of the Overwatch Council had spoken, how could she say no? In this world, there was no official who would go against the Overwatch Council for the sake of a prostitute. Not even the princes would do something like that. If Mr. Fan wanted to destroy her, it would be easier than killing an ant. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, a little absent-mindedly. Sir Chanli said, "Mr. Fan. Oh no, I am going to make some small changes to the Baoyu brothel. I think Lady Qing'er will be of some use in this. Perhaps in the future, all the brothels in the Qing kingdom will need these changes." Si Qing'er was shocked. The Baoyu brothel's business was doing well, so the big boss had already used some of his capital to open up more branches in other provinces. But as of now, the brothel business in the Qing kingdom did not have a large share. As for changes, this was how the brothel business had been run since ancient times. Unless, like the big boss, the brothel made some changes to its operations. Was Fan Xian really going to go crazy and stop all the prostitutes in the world from selling? But the problem was, if the prostitutes did not sell, and if the pimps did not take in customers, would it still be a brothel? Sir Chanli did not know what she was thinking, and so he followed the instructions of his teacher and said, "First, the girls in the brothel from this day forward are to change their death contracts to living contracts. This will be for 5 years, and when the time is up, they will be free to go. Second, the Baoyu brothel must have a doctor to ensure that the girls are healthy, and only then can they receive customers. Third." Before he finished, Si Qing'er was confused and asked, "Change to living contracts? What is the need for that?" Sir Chanli explained, "Sir, I was wrong again. I thought that in this line of work, 5 years is the limit. We have to give people something to think about. If they think that they can only be ridden by others for the rest of their lives, and that there is no chance of them being redeemed, the girls will be in a bad mood. Naturally, they will not be able to treat the guests well." Si Qing'er mockingly said, 5 years is up. Do you think we poor women can stop selling? Who is going to remove their registration? The brothels of the Qing kingdom were not registered. Once a prostitute became a prostitute, she could not leave the brothel for the rest of her life, unless she was redeemed, or the government had given them a special order. According to what was said before, the Baoyu brothel signed a living contract for 5 years. After 5 years, the prostitutes in the brothel would not be able to escape. Regarding this question, Sir Chanli did not answer. Master Xian had said that he would deal with it in the future. Si Qing'er mockingly said, "As for the doctors, that is even more ridiculous. The girls in the brothel are of low status, and no doctor would be willing to visit them. It is difficult to even see a patient. So how could there be a doctor who would be willing to stay in the brothel? Would the men be willing to lose face like that?" Sang Wen, who had been silent this entire time, smiled and said, "The commissioner said that he has many students in the 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Hiring a few doctors would not be a problem." Si Qing'er gave a wry smile, and thought to herself that the 3rd Bureau of the Overwatch Council was the poison department that everyone feared. Was he going to become a doctor? She increasingly felt that Fan Xian was a man who only knew how to dream. She mockingly said, "So what if there are doctors? Even if the girls are clean, who can guarantee that the guests will not suffer from venereal diseases?" Sir Chanli felt a headache coming on and said, I do not have a good idea." It was not that he did not have a good idea. It was that Fan Xian's idea of industrializing prostitution had run into the problem of not being able to popularize condoms. Listen to the last few things first. He coughed and continued to say, "From now on, things like forced buying and selling cannot happen again. If something like this happens again, you will be held responsible." He stared into Si Qing'er's eyes until she lowered her head. "Things like young prostitutes cannot happen again. There should be a rule for drawing water, and it should be based on the brands of the girls. The girls should have 3 days off every month, and they can do whatever they want." As Big Boss Sher continued to speak, not only did Si Qing'er's face change, but even Sang Wen was dazzled. Finally, Si Qing'er could not help but open her eyes wide and say, "If this goes on, is the Baoyu brothel a brothel or a charity hall?" Sir Chanli looked at her and said, "The master has said that you are someone who was raised by Yuan Xian. Logically speaking, he should punish you. But because of your poor background, he will give you a chance to redeem yourself. You do not need to worry about whether the Baoyu brothel is a brothel or a charity hall. In any case, you should follow Lady Sang's lead and do your business. If you succeed in this endeavor, you can spread it all over the world. In the future, hundreds of thousands of girls in this brothel will be indebted to you. Consider it repaying the debt you have owed over the past few months." At this point, Sir Chanli finally brought up Fan Xian's name without hesitation. Si Qing'er was silent, and no one knew what she was thinking. Her face was full of fear. In fact, Sir Chanli's heart was full of fear. Although the Baoyu brothel would be monitored by Sang Wen, who had already joined the first bureau of the Overwatch Council. He was a scholar and a student of Fan Xian. Would he never be able to become an official? Would he only be able to stay in a brothel and be the owner of a brothel? He looked at Sangwen and found that this woman, who had been a singer, was calm and steady. It did not seem as if she was troubled by this. A few days later, there was an autumn rain midway, and it was mournful and rustling, forcefully turning the clear autumn air into a cold rainy night. The Baoyu brothel had been taken over by Fan Xian, and the second prince had already sensed an ominous omen. He had begun to make arrangements. Fan Xian, on the other hand, appeared to be rather relaxed. These few days, he did not go to the first bureau, nor did he go to Xinfeng restaurant to eat buns. Instead, he went to the Imperial College, and with a group of young teachers, he organized the carriage of books he had brought back from northern Qi. The autumn wind blew, and the water droplets that had been hanging on the clouds for a while finally fell. They were so sparse that it was irritating. From Dambo bookstore, Fan Xian walked north for a while, and then he arrived at the gate of the Imperial College. A large area here was managed by the Imperial College and the Tungwen Pavilion. The government offices that had been set up in the first year of the Qing calendar had long been dismantled. Fan Xian raised his black umbrella and walked among the students of the Imperial College. Occasionally, he would nod and greet the students who respectfully greeted him. Although his status was different from before, the emperor had not removed him from his fifth-level official position. Furthermore, he had given verbal orders for him to come to the Imperial College when he had time. Although he did not like being a teacher and had never come to class, he used his official position to come to the Imperial College to read books and hide from the wind and rain outside. He was very willing to do so. The first day he came to the Imperial College, the students could not help but be surprised. It had been almost a year since Sir Fan Jr. had come to the Imperial College. When the students thought of this young man, who now held a position in the Overwatch Council, they could not help but feel a sense of conflict and fear. They were not as enthusiastic as they had been a year ago. It was not until a few hours later that they realized Sir Fan Jr. was as easy to get along with as he had been in the past, that they became lively again. Arriving outside the study that the Imperial College had left for him, Fan Xian put away his umbrella and looked at the gloomy weather outside. He could not help but frown and push open the door to enter. Inside the room, a few of the Imperial College's teachers were organizing the books that Zhuang Mohan had given them. For the kingdom of Qing, the books in this carriage had a very beautiful symbolic meaning. The emperor greatly valued them, so the Imperial College did not dare to be negligent. The work of copying and maintaining the books was being carried out in an orderly manner. Seeing Sir Fan enter, the teachers hurriedly stood up and bowed. Fan Xian smiled and returned the greeting. The people in front of him were all mediocre and unaccomplished people. Because it was difficult for him to repair Zhuang Mohan's books by himself, he had forcibly taken them from the Imperial College. They had gotten along quite well over the past few days. The black cloth umbrella was placed in a corner, and water began to seep through the floor. There was a dark stove in the room, and as the two warmed, Fan Xian suddenly felt the humidity in the room increase. Feeling a little uncomfortable, he loosened his collar and said, "It's not good to be too wet. The weather is not cold yet. Sir, let us endure it for a while. How about we put out the stove?" One of the teachers explained, "Books need a certain temperature to be stored. It's not good to be too cold." Fan Xian knew this and said, "It's not winter yet. It should be fine to leave these books in the room. It's not good to be too damp either." Everyone agreed and began to bury their heads in their work. The Imperial College had inherited the style of the Kingdom of Qing's court. It paid attention to practical matters and was not easy to talk about. It was very different from Northern Qi. Fan Xian sat back down at his table, but before he had time to start working, he was asked to leave. Someone wanted to see him. "Why have you returned to the Imperial College today?" Fan Xian was a little surprised to see Xu Wu the scholar sitting in a chair, and he bowed respectfully. After his father-in-law, the Prime Minister, had stepped down, and the Minister of the Board of Rights had been hanged, the civil officials in the court had become a mess. Some were secretly watching Fan Xian, and some were following the Eastern Palace. Instead, it was the second prince, who had always been quiet, who, because of his many years of business and literary fame, had the most support from the civil officials. Xu Wu the scholar had once been a student of Zhuang Mohan, and had always had a great reputation. In terms of seniority, he was second to none in the court, but because he had passed the imperial examination in Northern Wei, he was now an official in the kingdom of Qing, so there was always a problem. In the turmoil of the 5th year of the Qing calendar, he had accidentally obtained the greatest benefit. Although he had been stripped of his position as Chancellor of the Imperial College, the original scholar of the Tungguan Pavilion had been implicated in the spring examination incident and had been removed from his position. Xu Wu the scholar was extremely noble. The scholar of the Tungguan Pavilion was extremely noble. With the removal of the Prime Minister and the absence of a new Prime Minister, the scholar of the Tungguan Pavilion had to enter the palace to discuss matters. He had truly entered the center of the Qing court and was equivalent to a prime minister. No matter how powerful Fan Xian was in front of him, he was still just an unranked official. Of course, Xu Wu the scholar was not stupid enough to see Fan Xian as a common official. If that was the case, he would not have come to find Fan Xian today. If Commissioner Fan can calmly return to the Imperial College, why can't I? Xu Wu joked with Fan Xian, who was about the same age as his son. It's cold outside, and you, a young man, know how to enjoy life and hide in the Imperial College. What? You don't want the Overwatch Council to be drenched in the rain? Cold wind and rain outside? Fan Xian did not know if Xu Wu the scholar's words had a hidden meaning. He smiled, not knowing how to respond. After Shi Chanli took over the Baoyue house, Yan Bingyun's actions began to unfold. First, he used the pressure of the Overwatch Council to force the Ministry of Justice to bypass the capital government. He directly issued an arrest warrant, focusing on a few crimes, and began to track down Yuan Meng. But Yuan Meng could really hide. Under the cover of King Jing's son, Hongcheng, no one knew where she was hiding. Fan Xian was not in a hurry. After all, issuing the arrest warrant was to lay the groundwork for what would happen next. The later Yuan Meng was caught, the better. In Yan Bingyun's plan, everything was connected. As long as he could achieve the results he wanted, it was fine. Just 2 days ago, rumors began to spread throughout the capital. It was said that the brothel owner Yuan Meng, who the Ministry of Justice had been searching for, was actually the mistress of King Jing's son, Li Hongcheng. Rumors spread easily, especially since Yuan Meng and Li Hongcheng were in a relationship. So, the capital was abuzz with discussion. Li Hongqing's reputation was like a piece of juicy meat on a hot day, and it was only a matter of time before his reputation became worse. Li Hongqing and the second prince were friends, and this was something everyone knew. Not long after, another rumor began to spread. The famous Baoyue house in the capital was in fact the second prince. The case of the missing prostitutes being investigated by the Ministry of Justice was inextricably linked to the royal family. These rumors were very convincing. For example, Yuan Meng used to be a popular figure on Lujing River. But aside from the prince, no one had ever seen her take on any other customers. Another rumor was that on a certain day, the second prince had a long conversation with Commissioner Fan of the Overwatch Council outside of the Baoyue house. Although no one knew what the conversation was about, the next day, the Fan family sold their shares of the Baoyue house to a mysterious businessman named Shi. These rumors were, of course, the work of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. When Fan Xian was forced to take up his post during the spring examination, he became the idol of the world's scholars. The Qing Kingdom's winning headquarter office, when it came to creating an image, they were very good at it. When it came to pouring dirty water, they did it very well. Of course, as the rumors spread, the people of the capital learned that the original owner of the Baoyue house was actually the second master of the Fan family. The reputation of the Fan family was affected by this. But the source of the rumors was in the hands of the Fan family. They randomly tossed out a few stories about Commissioner Fan beating his brother, the old minister punishing the family, the second master breaking his leg, and the howling of evil in the garden. The Fan family selling the brothel at a loss was enough to shock the people of the capital. In addition, the Fan family no longer had anything to do with the Baoyu house, so the rumors quickly died down. When it came to controlling public opinion, Fan Xian was very familiar with it. Back then, Wu Zhu had written a few thousand leaflets, and he was able to chase the eldest princess out of the palace. Now he was dealing with the second prince, who was even more immature. Therefore, the people of the capital always believed that the second prince and Li Hongcheng, who did not have any shares in the Baoyu house, were the true culprits behind the Baoyu house case. Fan Xian, on the other hand, was an innocent man. The Fan family must have had their reasons for doing so. Yan Bingyun's next step was to deal with the money between the second prince and the Cui family. Not even Fan Xian knew the specifics, but he trusted Yan Bingyun's abilities. He didn't want to get involved in this. Xu Wu, the scholar, looked at him and said with concern, "Did you know that yesterday the capital government accepted the Baoyu house case? Your second son's crime is not light. He committed murder, silenced witnesses, and forced prostitution. Today is the day he will be tried." Fan Xian gave a wry smile and said, "It is unfortunate that our family has produced such an unfilial son." Xu Wu shook his head and said, "The capital government has not yet gone to the manor to ask for him. I think they have other plans. Mr. Fan, the word trial is the most harmful. There is not much room for negotiation in a criminal case. If the capital government continues with the trial, the emperor will be alerted. I don't think it will end well." After this conversation, Fan Xian knew where the scholar stood. He was speaking on behalf of the civil servants in the court, and he was advising the Fan family to live in peace with the second prince. Not to mention the problem of the court's reputation, these elders believed that when two tigers fought, one would be hurt. Both Fan Xian and the second prince were the best of the Qing kingdom's younger generation. It didn't matter who lost in this fight. It would be a loss for the Qing kingdom. Of course, most people did not think Fan Xian had the right to fight a prince, even though he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian understood this, and so he knew that the scholar in front of him was trying to make peace for his sake. He couldn't help but feel touched. He smiled warmly and said, "Thank you for your advice. I believe you have already met the second prince." Xu Wu nodded. Ever since Fan Xian returned to the capital from northern Qi, he had been at odds with the second prince. The Overwatch Council had arrested many of the second prince's officials, and if he wanted to make peace, he had to first ask the second prince for his opinion. He did not expect the second prince to be so easy to talk to, and politely asked Xu Wu to speak on Fan Xian's behalf. Hearing Xu the scholar's words, Fan Xian laughed coldly in his heart. The second prince's nickname was Stone. How could he be so easy to get along with? The two sides had already shed all pretenses of cordiality, and he had been forced to send his brother to a distant foreign land. There had to be an explanation for the matter of his father-in-law being taken down by the eldest princess and the second prince, right? Furthermore, the spies of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council had already sent word that the second prince had already brought back the 3 killers of the Baoyu brothel, who had been hidden in secret. They were preparing to bring Fan Xizha back to the capital's court. The second prince had asked Xu Wu to speak on his behalf to temporarily calm Fan Xian down. Fan Xian was not that stupid though. He respectfully offered tea to Xu Wu and said, "This has nothing to do with the council, and it has nothing to do with me. I have been guarding the Imperial College these past few days, because I was afraid someone might misunderstand." Xu Wu could not help but smile wryly. The wrinkles on his face were full of pity, and he said, "Why fight with him? Even if we win this time, so what? No matter how many times we win, it cannot compare to the happiness of the emperor." Fan Xian's heart jumped, and he knew that these words were true. He felt even more grateful to the old scholar in front of him. Although he had other thoughts in his heart, he still responded warmly, "Since you have spoken, then I have nothing else to say. As long as the capital government leaves the Fan family some face, the Ministry of Justice case will not be investigated too deeply." In the eyes of an old official like Xu Wu, Fan Xian's reply seemed a bit rash. In the officialdom, there was always a need to conceal one's dignity. How could there be such a clear and unmistakable reason to talk about such illegal matters in front of the Prime Minister? But he also knew that Fan Xian's personality was like this. He smiled in satisfaction and did not say anything. He only watched the rain outside the window of the Imperial College, 3 li from the Jingdo government office, by the side of the Imperial Mountain Road. The autumn rain was falling heavily. The case of the missing prostitutes in the Baoyu brothel had already been investigated. Although the bodies had not yet been found, the capital government had already found the 3 murderers involved in the murder. If the 3 men who killed the prostitutes were arrested and brought to justice, then they would be able to claim that the second master of the Fan family was the mastermind behind the incident. This would be a huge blow to the Fan family, and it would also clear the second prince's name. So these 3 men were important figures. The second prince's people still did not understand why the Fan family had sent these 3 men to the capital government after carrying out the family's punishment. Did this not give them something to use against them? But it was not until the Fan family sold the Baoyu brothel and began to investigate Yuan Meng and point their finger at Li Hongqing that the second prince realized that Fan Xian was using these 3 men to make him feel better. He thought he had chosen peace, and so his reaction was delayed for a few days. But the second prince still felt that Fan Xian was being unwise. As long as these 3 men were in his hands, where could the fat, pockmarked man of the Fan family run to? Now the second prince was truly angry. Fan Xian really did not know how high the sky was and how deep the earth was. He dared to make a move against the second prince. Even the ghosts knew that the rumors in the capital were spread by him. At this time, although Crown Prince Hongqing was also very depressed, he could not go to the Fan Manor to fight Fan Xian. This was because King Jing was the first to get angry. After a beating, he locked him up in the manor to avoid the storm that was brewing in the capital. Watch him carefully. Do not let anyone else have the opportunity to come in contact with him. Do not give them the opportunity to retract their statements. Fan Wujiu, one of the 8 generals of the second prince's manor, had a gloomy expression on his face. He said to the bailiff sent by the capital government, "If you fail this mission, be careful of your own life." The bailiffs of the capital government nervously nodded. He was not nervous about this mission, but he was nervous about facing the 8 generals of the second prince. Yushan Road was only 3 miles away from the capital government. If it were not for the fact that he wanted to avoid suspicion, Fan Wujiu would have personally escorted these 3 men to the capital government's prison. The carriage began to move, and in the dark autumn rain, Fan Wujiu watched from afar. The carriage traveled in the rain, as usual. There were not many people on the street, and only a few passers-by with umbrellas in their hands walked by. At this time, the passers-by began to move. They flipped their umbrellas and pulled out sharp black-stained weapons. Calmly, they stabbed into the carriage. Fan Wujiu was shocked and rushed in that direction. But he was still some distance away from the carriage. Seeing the speed at which these people were moving, he knew he would not be able to save them in time. The sharp needles were as sharp as tofu. They pierced into the walls of the carriage and killed the 3 people inside. The passers-by pulled out the needles and did not make any unnecessary movements. Holding their umbrellas, they walked into the alleys on the side of the street and disappeared into the rain. Fresh blood flowed from the carriage. Fan Wujiu rushed over with a cold face. He pulled open the curtain and his face changed. The wounds all showed how professional the person who did it was. It was only a simple stab, and they were already dead. Fan Wujiu could not help but take a deep breath. He began to worry for the second prince. To kill the 3 people in the carriage so cleanly was already difficult. What was even more frightening was that the other side knew exactly when they would move the witnesses. It seemed that the Overwatch Council had hidden many spies in the second prince's camp, which was why they were able to control the timing and location of the attack so well. This assassination was so perfectly planned that it looked so natural and simple. It was like eating a meal, and it was not very thrilling. Only an expert like Fan Wujiu could find a soul-stirring feeling in such a plain killing situation. He did not need to think to know who had done it. Other than the assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, who always hid in the dark, who else could have done it? His face grew paler. He could not help but think, if those passers-by had been trying to assassinate him, would he have been able to survive? Everyone in the Second Prince's camp seemed to have underestimated Fan Xian's power. That was because the new generation of people in the kingdom of Qing did not know how terrifying the Overwatch Council was. Fan Wujiu nervously rubbed the dagger in his sleeve. For the first time, he felt that he should leave the Second Prince and save himself. My chess skills are not good. I play chess because I don't want to take the pieces, Fan Xian said with a face full of shame. He was playing chess with Xu Wu at the Imperial College. The court had ended early, and the disaster relief in the south was almost over. That was why Xu the scholar had so much free time. After only 2 rounds of chess, the old man found that Fan Xian, such an intelligent and quick-witted genius, was a complete and utter lousy chess player. He could not help but change his expression. He felt that playing this kind of chess, even if he won, would not be fun. Xu Wu sighed and said, Fan Xian, I see that you are very clever in everything you do. How is it that you are so lousy at chess? The two of them casually talked about the matters of the court. Because Minister Fan rarely talked about such things in the manner, and the Overwatch Council could not investigate their disputes in court, Fan Xian listened with great interest. He smelled some of the important matters of court that he could not touch with at his current rank. Now, Yan Xiaoyi was the governor in the north, and endlessly stretched out his hand for silver. The small battles in the south were also ongoing. The kingdom of Qing was currently lacking in silver. Fan Xian's heart was now at ease. As long as the emperor needed silver, the palace treasury would fall into his hands next year. The eldest princess was good at scheming, but when it came to making money from business, it was not very reassuring. The rain had stopped, and Fan Xian did not have the right to ask the old man to stay for a meal. He respectfully saw the scholar out the door, then turned around and returned to the room. He began to look through the collection of books that Master Zhuang had given him. After the teachers had left, he still had not left. He held a book in his hands, lost in thought. He knew what had happened in the capital today, but he did not take it to heart. The 3 people were already dead, but the families of the dead prostitutes had now come to the capital government to complain, pointing their fingers at the Fan family. Of course, Fan Xian would not kill them to silence them. The 3 people who had died today had been secretly hidden by the Second Prince. If he killed him, the Second Prince would not be able to report it to the emperor. Although Fan Xian was not a good person, he did not have the heart to kill the victims. In fact, he understood that if he did not care about his status as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, the resources and power he held were far greater than the Second Prince's. If there were no accidents in this battle, of course he would win. But the world did not know this. The only thing that Fan Xian cared about was the attitude of the emperor in the palace. If the emperor felt that these little bastards playing around was nothing, then Fan Xian could continue to play. He actually had a good grasp of the emperor's thoughts. The Second Prince was just a whetstone. Although he was used to sharpen the crown prince, he was also used to sharpen the future Overwatch Council Director Fan Jr. Looking at Director Fan Jr.'s methods and thoughts, it seemed like a good choice. Of course, if Fan Xian really did go too far, the palace would only need to issue an edict to settle the matter. He was not worried that the emperor would hurt him because of this matter. On the contrary, he would laugh at himself and think, everyone is a bastard. You, the emperor, can't kiss one egg and kiss another. The rain in Jingdo stopped. He quietly avoided everyone's gaze and left the Imperial College. In a clothing store, he took off his outer garment, revealing the pure work clothes underneath. He then took a normal outer garment from the hands of the lowly shopkeeper and put it on. Only then did he flip over his rain hat to hide his face and disappear into the streets of Jingdo. The rain had already stopped. The leaden clouds in the sky seemed to have been melted by the sun. They gradually thinned and flattened, then gradually split apart. Following the arc of the sky, they flowed toward the 4 corners of the sky, revealing a large piece of blue sky in the center, and the particularly fresh autumn day after their victory. The sun shone on the outside of the yamen of the capital government. A few rays of light penetrated into the hall, clearly illuminating the just and honorable sign in the hall. There was already a crowd gathered outside the capital government, waiting for the prefectural magistrate to personally investigate the Baoyue brothel case, which had recently caused a stir. This case had a background, a murder, and involved a prostitute that made people's imaginations run wild. It happened in a place of pleasure, and it satisfied many of the aesthetic requirements of the people of Jingdo. Thus, it was the focus of everyone's attention. If one did not know much about this case, it would be embarrassing to speak up. If the carriage drivers did not know the whole story of this case, they would not have the face to drive a carriage for a customer. Fan Xian disguised himself as a passerby and blended into the crowd. He looked into the yamen and couldn't help but feel a strange feeling in his heart. The capital government was the most important yamen, and the changes in personnel in the last 2 years could not escape his involvement. He was afraid that once this matter was over, the Jingdo prefectural magistrate would have to apologize and resign. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.